I never expected my life to sink into darkness, yet it all began with a simple, innocent phone call. My wife, whom I trusted, had been lying to me for years. I heard her giggle, a sound I hadn't heard since our honeymoon, and my world fell apart. She was not alone. She was among my so-called buddies. I followed them, my heart racing till I caught them in the act. Something inside of me cracked right then. I was not the man they assumed I was. They had no concept of my capabilities. Here's my tale. Enjoy viewing it. As my mind cleared, I began to observe my surroundings. The gloomy light in my basement workshop, coming from the partially open door, complemented how I felt. One of the rackets I had been repairing earlier was still tightly gripped in the vise on the workbench. I could hear our two youngest children playing on the other side of the wall and watching a Disney movie on the VCR. I sat in my old, worn-out recliner and gazed up at the clock on the wall. I'd been sitting there for over 30 minutes, my mind spinning in circles and not moving or seeing anything, trying to comprehend what I wish I had not heard. Dinner on Sunday evening was finished. My wife, Sally, was cleaning the kitchen and doing the dishes. While I was down in my workroom changing the grips on many of my rackets for the upcoming autumn racquetball leagues, I remembered how much I had enjoyed playing racquetball for the previous 7 or 8 years. I normally played a few mornings a week before going to work as an engineer at General Motors. In addition, I participated in an evening league each fall, winter, and spring. I was happy of how proficient I had gotten in such a short period of time, and I consistently placed in the top categories. I also participated in local tournaments many times a year, often finishing near the top. Playing racquetball on a regular basis helped me maintain my weight of around 200 pounds on my 6'2" frame. Our 7-year-old daughter Jessie had come down to the playroom to watch her favorite movie, and our 4-year-old baby Allison had followed suit. Allie was at the age where Jessie couldn't go anywhere without wanting to accompany her. Fortunately, Jessie didn't appear to mind this yet. I was concerned about the day when she would grow up and everything would change. Our son Jason, who is now 9 years old, was aware that he was a boy and the oldest kid. He thought he shouldn't have to play with his younger sisters. He was presumably in his room working on model planes and cars. Fortunately, Jason resembled me and other members of the Robinson family. He had brown hair, hazel eyes, a strong jaw, and a notable but not large nose. Jessie shared Sally's red hair and delicate features. Allie had golden hair, and despite her young age, she appeared to have a combination of both of our characteristics. I eventually finished repairing the grips of the 3 rackets I had in my exercise bag. I was checking the string tension and realized that a few of them would require new strings. Every week during a league match, something seemed to go wrong, such as a broken string. I checked on the girls who were watching The Lady and the Tramp before returning upstairs. As I proceeded quietly up the stairs, I saw that the basement door was slightly open. I could hear Sally's sweet voice over the phone. I considered surprise her for fun, despite the fact that we had previously spent some time together that morning. I was in the mood for some light-hearted entertainment. I moved closer to the door and looked inside to see where she was. Great. I grinned cheerfully. Sally was leaning against the kitchen countertop. She has her back to me. She was dressed in tight pants and held the phone to her ear. Her shirt was untucked and falling carelessly, revealing her naked midriff and a small portion of her bra. Her red hair was in a ponytail, which bounced as she spoke. Even after 3 children and 11 years of marriage, Sally still looked wonderful. She was around 5 or 6 inches tall and weighed under 130 pounds. By exercising regularly and eating healthily, her curves had softened with time and experience, but she appeared more attractive than she had when we married. She was 23, and I was only a year older. The kids may have slowed our intimate moments throughout the years, but we still made time for each other a few times per week. As I carefully opened the door wider, I could hear some of the conversation she was having on the phone about the schedule for Tuesday and Thursday from 9 to 3. I heard what she said. She paused to listen to what the other person was saying. Yes, I can talk. Phil is in the basement, with the girls. Why? Yep. I agree, Debbie. I've been thinking about it a lot recently. This weekend. I do not think we have any plans. I could probably do it. Now, I understand she was speaking with her friend and supervisor, Debbie Bradshaw. It seemed like they were preparing for their typical weekend shopping trip. This happened 3 to 4 times per year. I slowly pushed the door open a little more and prepared to make a rapid move for the prize that was appealing to me. But then I paused, perplexed by a weird sound. Sally was laughing. What in the world? She giggled again as she listened to what Debbie was saying. What truly startled me was that I hadn't heard Sally giggle like that since our honeymoon. Then she whispered gently, and I got what she said. I'd like to do it again before the water comes off. That reminded me of a conversation I overheard in a bar a few months back. Suddenly, I felt woozy. I leaned back on the basement step before softly closing the door behind me. Sally continued to chuckle and practically whisper into the phone. I could hear some of her words. The last time truly made me giggle. Yes, I understand. Yes, both of them. Tell them we will see. Cannot wait. I stood silently in the dark stairwell as she ended her call. I did not want her to know I was there. So I turned around and went silently back down the stairs to my workshop. I slumped into my chair, recalling a talk from last spring. It occurred following one of our final games in the Wednesday night racquetball league. We used to go to a bar approximately once a month for drinks. After an hour, just John Harrison, Craig Davis, and I remained. John and Craig were great buddies who had started performing at the Oak Park Y just a few years before. John liked beer, whilst Craig preferred soft beverages. Craig was an alcoholic who had stopped drinking some years before. I heard that his only problem with drinking was that he found it difficult to perform after a few beers. This definitely worried his wife. Craig still enjoyed going to bars and would always join the group when he could. Both were married. John had 2 children and Craig had 1, as usual. After a period of talking about the games, we moved on to women and their relationships. After a dozen nights at the pub with these 2, I discovered they didn't mind joking about their marriages. They sometimes seemed unduly interested in my marital and personal life, which made me nervous. At least once, I departed after only 1 drink to dodge the topic. On this particular night, Craig was making fun of John's wife, Mary. She wanted him to have a really personal procedure. I assumed they were discussing a treatment I had heard about, so I mentioned that Sally had asked me to explore it as well, so she could stop taking her medication. But we hadn't reached an agreement about it. Craig continued to smile, but John became uncomfortable. Oh no. She wants him to have his wart removed. Craig burst into laughter. Feeling perplexed, I asked, "What do you mean?" "I don't comprehend." John's face flushed slightly, but he stated that he has had a common wart a few inches back from the tip of his thing since he was a teenager. I couldn't stop laughing this time. I'd seen him in the shower before and knew he wasn't as endowed as he claimed. He explained that the wart had developed over the last few years and was beginning to worry his wife. John argued that the wart was crucial to their connection. He stated that when they were together in a certain position, it was optimal for her pleasure. He jokingly referred to it as his delightful little helper. But Mary remained firm. She wanted him to have it removed, even if it meant losing something valuable. She'd lost out on this bargain. John didn't appear to be angry that his wife was missing out. He was more anxious about losing an advantage he had while speaking with other women. His term was frequently mentioned in conversations and drew a lot of attention when he attempted to captivate women other than his wife. Around that time, I decided that things were getting too messy and left. Now I sat in the dark, thinking about that talk. I couldn't believe Sally would be involved in anything like what her phone call implied. Sally knew John and Craig were my racquetball mates. I had mentioned them several times before, and their names appeared on the match schedules I kept on our calendar. However, as far as I knew, they had never met. Despite my best efforts to ignore it, my mind continued to connect the dots. I felt a hard knot in my stomach. I became concerned and began to sweat. I couldn't believe Sally would act that way, and I prayed there was a good explanation for it. Debbie seemed to be involved in whatever was going on. Debbie Bradshaw, Sally's employer, became the assistant store manager at her company around 5 years ago. She'd relocated from a corporate headquarters near Detroit. Prior to it, she had worked at the business shortly after finishing college. After that, she traveled to the city for management training. Debbie was married to Josh, a certified public accountant, CPA. She met while in Detroit. Sally had informed me that Josh was her second spouse. Sally and Debbie were roughly the same age and became friends while Sally was expecting her daughter, Allie. Debbie was also pregnant with Shannon, their first child. Debbie and Sally's children were born only a month apart, bringing the two friends even closer. We had met Debbie and Josh several times over the years, generally at work gatherings that Debbie and Sally attended. We didn't know the same individuals, and most likely didn't have the same amount of money as them. Debbie was educated and attractive, with sparkling green eyes and blonde hair. It always felt like she needed to be the center of attention. Josh seemed like a decent man, but I assumed he was mostly concerned with his career. John and Craig joined the YMCA's racquetball league roughly 2 years ago. John operated a construction company, and Craig was the managing partner of a building company. His father-in-law was the primary partner. We were all roughly the same age, married and starting families, so we had enough to chat about. It was funny that the only time we genuinely spent time together was at racquetball games or over a couple of beers after our families had never met. When you start hanging out with new folks, you'll often discover that you have mutual friends. One day, I mentioned the business where Sally worked, and John said he knew someone there as well. It turned out to be Debbie Bradshaw. Debbie attended the same high school as John and Craig, although she graduated a year later. He added that they ran into each other a few times per year. The shopping expedition started around 2 years ago, when our youngest, Ali, was going through a difficult period for a few months. Sally was having a very difficult time with Ali. Jessie was in kindergarten, so she was only home for half of the day, attempting to care for 3 children. It was becoming increasingly difficult for her to keep the house in order while still working a few days per week. I wasn't much help back then because I was working additional hours per week on a project I needed to complete. Things got really challenging. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, she began crying on the couch because she was exhausted and irritated. I approached her, placed my arms around her, and held her till she relaxed while we discussed what was going on. She mentioned that if she could simply take a break now and then, she would feel better. I felt bad about not being present as much as I should have, so I offered to care for the kids totally during my next weekend off. She thanked me with tears in her eyes and said she would consider it. A few weeks later, Sally informed me she discussed with Debbie the need for a vacation from the kids. Debbie recommended that they go shopping together at several posh malls in Detroit's suburbs. She was confident that her husband would not mind, despite my reservations about allowing her to buy at an expensive mall with a credit card. I agreed. So, on my next free weekend, Sally and Debbie went early Saturday morning for Detroit. They stopped for brunch on the way and then visited one of the malls. In the afternoon, they checked into a motel, ate dinner, and went to the movies. Before she left, I requested her to phone me as soon as she checked in. She gave me her phone number and room number. The next day, they checked out, had brunch, and went to another mall before returning home about 5 p.m. Sally was really grateful for the trip. When she walked in, she hugged and kissed me and enthusiastically discussed the businesses and restaurants. That night, we had a great time together. She didn't go overboard shopping, but she did get a few lovely things for herself and the kids. I was glad for her, and the kids had done well for me, so I had no complaints. That was more than 2 years ago now. Following that weekend, shopping trips became a regular occurrence. Every 3 to 4 months, the two of them would leave on Saturday morning and return late Sunday afternoon. I didn't mind. I like spending time alone with the kids, and it appeared to make Sally happy. I tried to think of anything that felt different since the trips began. I remembered that the second time she departed, she returned in a very different mood than the first. For some reason, she appeared depressed and on edge. I asked her about it that Sunday night. She replied nothing was wrong, but she had started her period, which I knew made her feel low at times. That night, nothing transpired between us. I started thinking about it and realized that after our first time together, we never had that wonderful moment when she returned. It didn't happen for several days after that, but we always spent time together before she went for her vacations as the dates approached. Sally was always quite pleased, almost enthusiastic. I hadn't noticed it before, but I'm starting to wonder why. Just then, I heard Sally call from the top of the stairs. "Phil, it is time for the girls to take a bath. Could you send them up?" I sat there, trying to collect my thoughts. "Phil? Can Phil hear me?" I finally got out of my chair and walked to the bottom of the steps. I called up to her, feeling annoyed. "Yes, I heard you. I will acquire them." I entered the playroom and got the kids moving after some back and forth. After they walked upstairs, I moved around the room, tidying up and putting things away. I mainly did this to pass the time. I needed to calm down and not express my emotions on the outside. Finally, I couldn't wait any longer and returned upstairs. Sally was in the kitchen, looking at a cookbook when I stepped in. She turned to me, threw her arms around my neck, and gave me a fast kiss before I realized what was going on. She pulled back, looked into my eyes, smiled, and asked, "Is there anything wrong, honey?" "You appeared upset." I felt weird and said something about noticing a crack in one of my favorite rackets, but I continued looking into her eyes, wanting to see whether my concerns were legitimate. But there was nothing. She was simply Sally, the lady I cared for. She laughed and kissed me again. After a minute, she stated, "Debbie called while you were downstairs. She asked whether we could go shopping next weekend." Like she spoke, her eyes altered, like if a shadow had passed over them. As I observed her, she blinked and turned away from me. I could tell she was hiding something. I wondered how long this had been going on. I quickly tried to think of a way to postpone our vacation until I could figure something out. "Don't we have plans for next weekend?" I replied hesitantly. "Nothing on the calendar," she said. I thought there was a VFW event on Saturday night that we could attend. I spoke carefully, hoping to bring her on board. Sally drew back and stared at me attentively. "Phil, you know I dislike those things. I don't care if Dad goes. All you do is speak about the army and drink a lot. It's quite dull for me. So, if you want to go, you can hire a babysitter while I am away. So how about we take the kids somewhere exciting this weekend? Cedar Point will only be open for a few more weeks before closing for the year, and we have yet to take Allie there. She is old enough to have fun now," I replied, attempting to explain myself. Sally frowned and her cheeks grew crimson, indicating that she was quite furious. "We just took the kids to Mackinac Island a few weeks ago." "What is wrong with you, Phil? You never bothered about my shopping trips previously," I responded, feeling a little angry. "Forget it. I just figured we could spend some time together. You and Debbie can have fun. I'm going upstairs to help the kids with their bedtimes." I turned and climbed the stairs to the bedrooms. Halfway up, I looked back and noticed Sally eyeing me with an odd expression. The rest of the night, I kept quiet and avoided actual conversation with her. As with most work nights, I went to bed before Sally. I laid there, trying to sleep. Later, I heard her go in and go to the restroom to change into her pajamas. When she climbed into bed, she nestled against my back. She wrapped her arm over me and gently said, "Phil." "Phil." I maintained my breathing slow and regular, pretending to be asleep. After a while, she gave up and turned away from me. I could tell from her breathing. When she finally dozed off, I rolled onto my back and glanced at the ceiling, trying to gather my thoughts. I reflected on my life and how I got up here. I grew up less than 20 miles from where we are today. It was a regular middle-class household consisting of my mother, father, older sister, and me. Jason, or Jace as everyone called him, was my best buddy and the most thrilling part of my upbringing. His family lived at one end of the street, while mine lived on the other. We met in 4th grade and have been great friends since. If he wasn't at my place, I was at his. Not a week passed without one of us sleeping at the other's place. He was usually full of enthusiasm and pleasure. Jace was always the funniest one, cracking jokes and giggling. He made friends wherever he went. I was more quiet and thoughtful. We balanced each other out nicely. We grew up playing sports together and began to notice girls. We even went on some double dates. We never became too serious with any one female. We both had our first experiences in the months preceding senior prom at school. We were both ordinary students, although I normally received higher grades than Jace. However, I discovered something I truly enjoyed: drafting. By my senior year, I had taken all of the drafting classes available. I started really considering becoming an engineer. After graduation, I decided to attend a nearby community college with an engineering technology program. It was inexpensive and I could stay at home while commuting. Jace was unsure of his career goals, so he enrolled in general studies. The primary reason was that it allowed us to escape getting conscripted into the military for a while. As my first year of college came to a close, I made a significant error. Jason, I attended a party one Saturday night and was stopped by the cops on my way home. I failed my breath test and had to spend the night in jail. Mom and Dad arrived the next morning to get me up, and they were understandably angry. After all was over, I had to spend all of my savings on penalties, legal fees, and other expenses, and I lost my driver's license for a year. For a while, I rode with Jace, feeling melancholy about everything. But then I realized this isn't working. Being broke and without a driver's license did not motivate me to return to school the following year, so I took a chance and joined the Army. I hoped that with my training I could land a career in engineering and stay out of Vietnam. At least that is what the recruiter promised me. He clearly lied when I told Jace about my plans. He readily agreed to accompany me. We accepted the recruiter's offer to sign up together and train side by side. Basic training was difficult, but manageable. Halfway through, we took a series of tests to determine which careers would best suit us. The Army determined that we would be effective as fire direction control specialists. This employment required them to use a device known as an FDC computer, which was just a sophisticated calculator. It assisted us in determining distances, directions, and the amount of explosive material to utilize so that artillery shells might reach their intended objectives. Following basic training, we were assigned to Fort Sill to learn our new job. The setting wasn't particularly great, but with Jace by my side, we still managed to have fun. But it was nothing compared to the next surprise we received. Orders for Vietnam arrived just a few weeks before graduation. We flew to Ecor in Vietnam after a 15-day vacation, spent visiting relatives, drinking with old friends, and hooking up with a couple of our previous girlfriends. After some difficult discussions with the personnel office, we were both assigned to a battery in the 2nd Battalion, 11th Artillery Brigade. It was November 1969, and President Nixon had already begun to reduce the number of troops as he prepared to hand over the fight to the South Vietnamese. What a dumb concept that was. We didn't observe any action for the first 5 or 6 months. We completed a lot of sorties from fire support bases all throughout I Corps, but we only had a few attacks up to that point. The finest part of our trip was taking a rest in Bangkok, Thailand after 15 days of partying and drinking. Jace and I returned to our headquarters, exhausted and eager to relax. When we learned that our battalion had joined the 3rd Brigade, 101st Airborne, while we were away, no one appeared really interested. A few days later, however, our group was flown by helicopter to a bare hill in the thickest jungle I'd ever seen since arriving in Vietnam, and I began to feel nervous. 4 months later, I arrived home on a stretcher. Jace was transported back in a bag. Everything I had gone through had left me physically and mentally damaged. I spent weeks in the hospital and several months in rehabilitation. I also spoke with a psychiatrist to help me understand what had transpired. After they determined that I was relatively fit for service again, I was assigned back to Fort Sill as an assistant instructor in a training group. I didn't want to talk to anyone, so I registered for classes at the local college. I spent my free time focusing on academic tasks. After a year, I requested to leave the Army early and return to school. As the Vietnam War came to a conclusion, the Army became smaller. I applied and got accepted into an engineering program at a nearby institution. The Army granted my request, and I was freed 5 months early after serving 2 years and 7 months. I went back in with my parents and applied for veterans benefits. Living at home, I didn't require much. I'd saved the most of my money from Vietnam, and my schooling benefits, combined with a part-time work, paid my expenses. Looking back, I felt like a typical Vietnam veteran, having seen too much and struggling to find my place. The way people reacted to the battle and my injuries, together with everything I had seen and done, made me feel resentful and alone. I stopped caring about my appearance. I grew my hair long and let my beard grow. Most of the time, I wore hooded sweatshirts or an old army jacket. I matched them with tattered denim and old sneakers. I attended school, worked, and came home. I could tell my mother, father, and sister Terry were concerned about me, but I felt isolated from everyone. I continued to attend a VA therapist roughly once a month, but it did not appear to be very helpful. I'd pay Jason's folks a visit about once every week. We would talk about him and our good moments together. They enjoyed the discussions, and I thought that was the least I could do for them. One afternoon, I was seated in the study hall of the International Center on campus. Several days a week, I had a few hours between classes, which I normally spent studying or reading. As I tried to ignore the crowd, a voice sliced through my thoughts. "Is it okay to sit here?" I looked up and did a double take. She had long red hair and a smooth complexion that only redheads appear to have. Her inquiring brown eyes were fixed on me, waiting for my response. I was frightened and observed her nice red lips. I wondered what it would be like to kiss her. I was deep in thought when she spoke again. "Would you mind if I sat here?" I promptly expressed my shyness. "No. Go ahead." She placed her books on the table and drew out a chair to settle down. I observed her out of the corner of my eye. She was perhaps 7 or 8 inches shorter than my 6'2" frame and appeared to weigh about 120 pounds. She looked lovely for the next half hour. She was focused on her books, while I feigned to be focused on mine. Sometimes I found myself admiring her appearance, after I had done this several times. I noticed she was staring at me. She pointed at my jacket and inquired, "Are you a veteran?" I nodded yes, and she asked about Vietnam. I was a little worried when she asked that because people usually have strong feelings about it, but I just replied yes and didn't elaborate. A few minutes later, she exclaimed excitedly, "My father is a veteran. He participated in the Korean War. He was a Marine." I felt a little more at ease and thought maybe this chat wouldn't be too horrible. She then said that he had been wounded. She said it as if it were no great thing. I thought to myself, people who have not served don't get it. But I just nodded and told her I'd been in the Army for nearly 3 years, omitting the details about Vietnam. We kept conversing until she said she needed to go to class. She grabbed her books, said goodbye, and walked out the door. I was sad to see her leave. She was the first woman I had really spoken to since returning home. A few days later, I was sitting in nearly the same position when I heard the same voice remark, "Hey, do you mind if I sit here?" This time I responded more clearly than previously. I attempted to concentrate on my book, but she began conversing with me as if we were already close friends. After a while, she paused and, seeming little bashful, added, I just realized I've been talking a lot and I don't even know your name. Feeling a little embarrassed, I extended my hand and said, "It's Phil Robinson." She grinned and responded, "My name is Sally Baxter. Nice to meet you." We realized that we both had extensive breaks between classes on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Over the next few weeks, we talked during the majority of our breaks. I found out a lot about her life, including her family, friends, and ambitions for school and career. Aside from being attractive, she was kind and easy to chat to. Her pleasant demeanor reminded me a lot of Jay. I found myself telling anecdotes about my family and school, but not much about the Army. To be honest, I enjoy listening to her more. She could have read anything to me, and I would have paid attentively. I was really attracted to her. She made me want to care about more than just education again. After our second encounter, I began shaving in the morning for the first time in weeks. After the third or fourth time, I got a haircut and started dressing nicer. My mother saw the change in me right once and began asking questions. I sheepishly told her about the girl who had piqued my curiosity. She teased me a little, but I could see she was pleased for me. A few weeks after we met, I worked up the guts to ask her out on a date. She smiled and promptly replied yes. She, like me, was traveling from home to school. After agreeing to let me pick her up on Friday night, she chuckled and remarked, "Just so you know, my father can be tough on guys who ask me out. Are you certain you want to go through with this?" I gazed into her eyes and responded, "Sally, I believe that if I get to go out with you, I can handle your father for a few minutes or even longer," I thought to myself. Her cheeks flushed and she exclaimed, "Oh my, you're such a flatterer." I observed she blushes easily. On Friday night, I knocked on her door, and a friendly woman answered before I could say anything, saying, "You must be Phil. We have been waiting for you. Please come inside." She took my hand and led me in. As she did so, she cried out to Jack, "Sally's date is here." Then she turned to me with a loving grin and told me not to worry about Sally's father. "He's not as dangerous as she claims. I'm Emily," she spoke, shaking the hand she was still holding. When her father walked in from the kitchen, I had no idea how to reply. He was a large man about my height, who weighed approximately 30 pounds more than me. He appeared solid and not overweight. "I'm Jack," he remarked in a strong voice, extending his hand and looking directly at me. "Phil Robinson," I responded by shaking his hand firmly. "Come inside the family room. We can talk for a few minutes while Sally finishes up." He advised that the three of us walk through the kitchen to a nice area with wood paneling. A television sat in one corner, surrounded by a sofa and a pair of comfortable seats. A fireplace occupied one side of the room, with a mantel running along the wall. There was a gorgeous wooden box in the shape of a triangle containing a folded American flag. On the opposite side of the shelf was a wooden box with a glass front. I'd seen identical things in stores throughout my Army days. They were used to display military accessories such as patches, ribbons, and medals. An M1 Garand rifle was displayed in the center on a stand. It featured a glossy hardwood handle and a leather strap. It appeared to be really strong and severe. Above the rifle was a framed Marine Corps flag. Everything about it felt intensely powerful. Jack caught me looking at the shelf and expressed his pride. "I served as a Marine in Korea. I hoped to stay longer, but I was hurt in a combat near Busan. Then I was hurt again while fleeing from Chosun Reservoir. I could not pass the physical after that." I nodded and responded, "Yeah, Sally mentioned that." "It's been tough. Sally mentions that you are a Vietnam veteran," Jack inquired as the three of us settled in. "I stayed there for a time," I replied, feeling little apprehensive. "What did you do when you were there?" "I worked as a fire direction control specialist in an artillery battery," I explained. He nodded. "What are the most powerful artillery pieces in Vietnam?" "Were you stationed?" Emily added. You have to excuse Jack. He is a huge fan of military history. He understands a great deal about the war. That is okay. Our battery was active all across I-Corps. Jack looked at me as if he didn't know if I was a real soldier like him or someone who had stayed behind. However, Marines frequently held negative attitudes toward soldiers. I-Corps, that was Marine territory. By the time I arrived, most of the Marines had already left. Jack laughed a little. Yeah, Vietnamization. Nice phrase. That means take this country. It is yours. Now, Jack, it is not over yet. Emily claimed it was almost finished. Simply wait and see. He insisted on glancing at her. I was relieved when Sally walked in. It was evident that this conversation could go on indefinitely, and the last thing I wanted to discuss was Vietnam. We spent a few minutes talking about school and our plans for the evening. Then we said our goodbyes and departed. That night, we went out to dinner and a movie. I don't recall much of it because I was so focused on our chat. In the theater, we sat together with our heads almost touching after the film. We didn't want the evening to finish, so we stopped for a drink. I brought her to her door only a few minutes before she was expected to arrive home. As I stood there, hesitant, I wanted to hold her and kiss her, but I was also frightened of ruining the pleasant evening. She stretched up, threw her arms around my neck, and placed her nose almost to mine. She gazed into my eyes and spoke softly. Thank you, Phil, for a fantastic evening. Time seemed to stand still as I gazed into her lovely brown eyes. I felt like I could see straight into her heart. Everything about her, who she was and who she could become, was obvious to me. At that point, I realized I loved her. I softly grasped her waist and kissed her. From that day forward, we would have moments like that a few times a week, with her arms around me and my holding her tight. We'd look into one another's eyes, expressing all of our emotions. She eventually pulled away. Looking uneasy, he entered the house. The next day, I called her and we spoke for an hour. We scheduled another rendezvous for the middle of the week and were together almost immediately. A few weeks later, I informed her that I had reserved a motel room for Saturday night. She reddened, as she often did, before smiling and nodding. That evening was everything I had hoped for. We had some previous experiences, but we were still learning about each other. There were a few difficult moments when she discovered my scars from Vietnam, but I convinced her that the doctors had helped me heal and that I was fine. As we slept together after that first magical moment, I could feel her tears on my neck and shoulder. I muttered quietly in her ear, "Sally, I love you." I know you don't want to hear it yet, but I can't keep it from you. Sally drew her face back and stared down at me. I could see tears in her eyes and a grin on her lips. I love you, Phil. I never imagined it could feel like this. I want to be like this forever. I chuckled in relief and kissed the tip of her nose. I am not sure about forever, but I know I want to do this again and again. She laughed and groaned playfully as I approached her. Oh, Phil, whatever you want, just tell me. For the first time since losing Jace, I felt at ease and pleased. I believed that everything would be fine. I could imagine a future with someone I loved and who loved me back. By the time we left the motel, fatigued and delighted in the early morning light, we decided we wanted to spend the rest of our lives together. We discussed everything that night, including our dreams, marriage, children, where we wanted to live, and what we wanted to accomplish in life. Even though Sally was a year younger than me, she was 1 year ahead in school. She was scheduled to graduate at the end of the spring, whereas I would finish a year later. We planned that after Sally graduated, she would begin working, and we would wait to marry until I finished school. In the meantime, I'd look for an apartment where we could stay together till then. A week later, I drove Sally home to meet my folks. My father, Dave, worked as a tool maker at General Motors. Since my sister and I started high school, my mother, Donna, has worked as a part-time teacher's aide. Sally and my parents got along really well. My mother later stated that they liked Sally not only for who she is, but also for helping me come out of my shell. I'd changed a lot. I was quite happy. I couldn't stop smiling for most of the time. I was so cheery that the following time I met my therapist, he asked me to leave and advised me not to come back for a while. There was still some friction between Sally's father and me. I believe he was concerned about the boy who had captured his youngest daughter's heart. The fact that we were so close made things harder. The look on his face when we discussed living together before marrying was frightening. Everything changed a few months later when Jack and Emily invited us to supper. After the meal, Jack and I went into the living room, while Sally and her mother remained in the kitchen, putting away food and conversing. After we had discussed the normal topics for a few minutes, Jack halted and remarked, "Sally noted that you have some major scars from Vietnam. She was intrigued as to how you acquired them." I looked away because I was shy for some reason. "Yeah, it's not something I want to talk about, especially with her." Jack nodded and said, "I get it. People who have not been there frequently don't comprehend." After a minute, he said, "Phil, you made it sound like you didn't see much combat over there." I paused and replied that I really didn't, until the final firebase I was at. Following a little delay, he inquired as to which firebase it was. I paused again. "Ripcord." Jack's eyes widened. "Ripcord. Were you at Ripcord?" I nodded my head. "Summer of 1970, he asked with a serious expression. I nodded again. I was amazed that he knew about Ripcord. The Army had worked hard to keep the conflict quiet because so many people had died. It was easier for them because President Nixon was also preoccupied with the fighting in Cambodia at the time. Just then, Sally and her mother returned to the room, and we started talking about school and Sally's forthcoming graduation. Jack and I never discussed my service again. But from that day on, Jack treated me like the son he wished he had. Things began to move rapidly after that. Sally received high marks during her graduation. She got an excellent job as an assistant buyer at a local retail store. She spent as much time as she could in my apartment, but her parents made it obvious that she could not live with me full time. I finished school on time and began working as a draftsman for General Motors before graduating. We were married 2 months later. Because we both worked, we were able to purchase a little Cape Cod home on a large lot. This allowed us to expand our home as needed. 1 year later, our son Jason was born. He was named after my best friend, and he was awesome. 2 years later, we welcomed a daughter called Jessie. We felt we were done having children at that point, but after much deliberation, we chose to have another child. 3 years after Jessie, we welcomed Allison. It was wonderful to have a son, but I felt particularly attached to the girls. Sally decided to work part-time in a retail setting after Jason was born. She wanted to continue working at least part-time while raising the children, and she intended to return to full-time work once they were all in school. Right now, she was working 12 to 20 hours per week. It worked out well because she received a significant employee discount, which was helpful given the high cost of buying clothes for the kids. My job has changed significantly since I started. Initially, I focused on converting part designs into computer codes for equipment used in product manufacturing. By the time Allie was born, we were just beginning to see the first design software being developed, and the company recruited me to be part of a team that learned how to use it. Life was good. We earned enough money to buy 2 automobiles and a wonderful, warm home. During our children's childhood, we added a bedroom, a bathroom, and a fully finished playroom. We were fortunate to have 3 healthy, delightful children. We had a lot of fun as a family doing various activities. Every year, our family went on at least one trip together. Sally and I also made arrangements to send the kids to their grandparents' house for a long weekend just for us, twice per year. I always thought our marriage was strong. We were close and had many joyful occasions. Sally was always willing, and I think she enjoyed being with me. Sometimes she appeared to be quite excited, which made me happy as well. We both felt comfortable beginning those intimate times together. We were never bashful in expressing our love. We hugged, held hands, and touched each other frequently. I would look at her, then at other spouses and their wives, and realize how fortunate I was. I often told her this. I felt we shared the same spark and connection. We had it 10 years ago, but now I wasn't sure. I could feel my life unraveling. I struggled to sleep most nights and probably only got a few hours of sleep. I opted not to work out at the Y the next day. Instead, I entered the office, closed my door, and gazed at the wall. I realized I needed to devise a strategy to figure out what was happening. I could ask Sally what occurred, because she had never lied to me before. But if she was already hiding something, would she tell me now? How can I be certain? I remembered what I had overheard and noticed in her eyes. I started sketching on a notepad, jotting down some thoughts for what to do next. I needed to take measures to find out the truth. But when I thought about what I'd do if the news was terrible, I felt lost. I adored Sally and my children. The thought of being without them terrified me. Even terrible was the possibility that Sally might not truly love me. For the next 4 days, I felt like a zombie at work and home. I could not think of anything else. Sally didn't notice anything unusual until Jess stated that Dad didn't look like himself. I assumed it was simply because I was thinking about work. On Tuesday, I resumed my normal routine and went to play racquetball before work, just as I always done. John was present, as was Craig. I realized I'd never seen John without Craig, or the other way around. It occurred to me that if John was up to something, so was Craig. When I walked into the locker room, I noticed them at the end of an aisle, changing and spoke quietly to each other as they looked up to see me. John chuckled, and Craig smirked, as if he knew something I didn't. I now see that his smirk was a typical expression for him. I felt a pressure in my chest and became upset. For the first time, I saw them as rivals. John was about an inch taller and about 10 pounds heavier than me. Craig was somewhat shorter and stronger, but I generally win racquetball since I've been playing for longer and am in better shape. I held my composure while joining a few others for some casual matches. John and Craig were friendly, and we chatted briefly before getting cleaned up and heading to work on Wednesday. I wanted to know where John and Craig would be on Saturday. I called John's residence from my job and spoke with his wife. I introduced myself as a member of his racquetball group and inquired about John's availability on Saturday. She informed me that she believed he was heading to a business convention in Detroit that afternoon and would return on Sunday. My heart sank when I heard that. Following a hunch, I called Craig's home and received the same response from his wife. I carefully hung up the phone and glanced out the window. This was true. It had to be true. The 4 of them were together down there, but I was curious how far things had progressed. It was simply too much for me. I was very irritated. A small voice in my head kept whispering, "Do something." On Friday night, after work, I went to see my parents. Dad had stopped working earlier this year, and they intended to spend the winter in Florida, but for the time being, they were busy sprucing up the house to sell in case they found a place they liked down there. They also enjoyed spending time with their grandchildren whenever they could. I told them I needed to talk, so we sat at the kitchen table with some iced tea while I figured out how to break the news. Finally, I took a deep breath and stated, "I'm not sure how to say this, so I'll just say it. I believe Sally is being unfaithful to me." As soon as I mentioned it, tears began to fall, and I could barely hold back my sobbing. It was the first time I'd shouted those dreadful words aloud. Mom and Dad looked stunned. "No, that can't be true. Not Sally. She would not do that to you. She would not do that to you." Mom whispered, "Why do you think that, son?" Dad inquired softly. I reflected on what I'd heard and learnt. Mom sat silently, crying and shaking her head. Dad reached out, drew her close, and hugged her fiercely. "Phil, what do you need from us?" Dad asked. "I need to know for sure. I need to be where they are tomorrow night. I realize it's a lot to ask, but could you watch the kids for me tomorrow and keep them till Sunday?" I begged. Dad nodded. "Of course, We'll fail, but I hope this is all a misunderstanding. I nodded back. Yeah, I agree, but it's difficult to understand how that could happen. Shaking my head, I stood up and went when I arrived home. Sally was joyfully strolling around, finishing her food. She spun around when I entered the kitchen, placed her arms around my neck, and kissed me. The kids are in the recreation room, and dinner will be served in about 20 minutes, she replied with a smile. I could see she was enthusiastic about the weekend ahead. She seemed to have a bounce in her step. I suddenly remembered how long it had been since we had been close. We generally had special times during the week, but we missed them this time. I'd been feeling sad lately, and some nights I used sleeping medications to help me sleep. Sally hadn't mentioned anything about it, and I was curious how she felt. I paused, but then replied, "Honey, I just realized we haven't had our special time since last Saturday, and you are going to be busy this weekend. Would you like to put the kids to bed early tonight so that we can spend some time alone?" Sally drew her arms back and took a few steps away. I saw her expression alter again, and her grin appeared forced. "Gee, Phil, I'd love to, but I got my period a little early today," she said cautiously. I responded without much feeling. "Oh, yes, I understand." She reached up to gently brush my cheek. "I promise to make up to you as soon as I feel better." Okay, I had to stop myself from pulling away. "Yes, there is a plan," I murmured. She hugged me and enthusiastically resumed making dinner. I turned and took a slow walk up the stairs to change. Sally's periods have been regular since she began taking the pill. I realized she was waiting for her date tomorrow. If I had any doubts previously, I knew my fury had grown, and that voice inside me was telling me to do something. It was getting louder. Getting through dinner without expressing my feelings was difficult. The youngsters chatted away as normal, and Sally had no idea anything was wrong. Could this be our last meal together as a family? I turned away, tears welling up in my eyes at the notion. The next day, we went about our typical Saturday routine. The elder children tidied their rooms after breakfast. Allie pretended to help. After they finished, kids could watch cartoons. I worked in the garage until Sally was about to depart. Then I went back inside. Sally was heading down the stairs with her bag, instructing the kids to behave while she was away. Allie dashed behind her, saying, "Buy me something, Mommy." Sally paused at the foot of the steps, set down her suitcase, and grabbed Allie for a hug. "I will, baby. Be good to Daddy." Sally handed Allie over to me, kissed me, and said, "I have to leave. I am due to pick up Debbie in 20 minutes. I nodded. "Don't forget to call me as soon as you arrive at the hotel." She laughed and responded, "I always do." This is the Red Roof Inn in Rochester Hills. By then she had left. I stood on the porch holding Allie and watched as she drove away without looking back. When she was out of sight, I went back inside and contacted Jace and Jesse. I had at least 2 hours before Sally called to tell me she arrived safely. That was more than enough time to do my tasks. The two of them dashed down the stairs, chatting enthusiastically and asking what I wanted. I told them we were going to Grandma and Grandpa's for the night, so they should bring a bag containing pajamas, a change of clothes, and their favorite toys. With only a few complaints, and without answering all of their inquiries, I got them turned around and returned them to their rooms. I helped Allie load our belongings, and we were soon out of the home and in the car. When we arrived, Mom and Dad were waiting at the entrance. As I was leaving, I managed to unload and set up everything in the house. Dad looked apprehensive and replied, "Good luck, Phil." "I hope you are mistaken." I exhaled. "I know, Dad. So do I. Thank you for everything. I will call you tomorrow morning." I drove home, stopping at the airport to change vehicles. I did not want anyone to recognize my car when I arrived at my location. A few hours later, I remained in the kitchen staring at the clock. My mind kept replaying everything that transpired this week. When the phone eventually rang shortly after 1 p.m, I looked at it for a bit before snapping back to reality and answering. "Is that you, Philip?" I overheard Sally say. "Yeah, it's me. You did not even say hi. Is everything okay?" "Everything is fantastic. Just fantastic." "How about you, all set on your end?" I added a dash of sarcasm. "I'm not sure what you mean by all set, but we made it here. Fine." We stopped for lunch on the way down. We're in room 168, and the number is 556-4 or 50168. We talked about minor issues for a few minutes. She then said, "Debbie is waving to me. I need to go. We're spending the afternoon in Meadowbrook Village Mall. See you tomorrow." The phone fell silent as she hung up without waiting for me to say goodbye. I assumed she didn't even say "I love you," and she hadn't said it this morning when she left. I contacted the Red Roof Inn and asked for a room. I wanted to know if Sally Robinson had checked in. They confirmed that she had and asked if I wanted to talk with her. I responded no, everything was okay. I'd see her later. I hung up and called again. This time I inquired whether a John Harrison was registered. They claimed there was, but he had not yet checked in. I said I'd call back later and hung up. I sat there staring at the phone, attempting to quell the rage that was building inside me. It was a frightening emotion I hadn't had in a long time. I stood up and carefully headed down to my workshop. I unlocked the cupboard containing my guns. I examined my father's old 16-gauge shotgun, my Winchester Model 73 rifle, and the pellet gun that I used to play with as a child. Dad gave me the shotgun when he and Mom decided to relocate before retiring last year. I purchased the Winchester when I was in high school. I'd been hunting deer for a few years, but after Vietnam, I couldn't stomach the prospect of hunting again. I stood there, deep in thought. I knew that if I took a gun, I might never see my children again. I leaned down and opened the bottom drawer, revealing an old battered shoebox tucked in the corner. I carried the box upstairs and emptied the contents onto the kitchen table. I went through the stuff to find what I needed. I took out the marine KBR knife I had purchased in Bangkok and checked its sharp edge. The handle was a rich rusty color. I returned it to its bag, bent down, and pulled up my pants leg to secure it to my calf before covering it up again. Next, I gathered a few items that I might need, including driving gloves, a water bottle, and a couple of candy bars. It was after 2 p.m. when I got behind the wheel of the automobile and drove the 90 miles to Rochester Hills. I arrived at the Red Roof Inn's parking lot and drove slowly around the building until I reached room 168. I pulled into a parking spot a few rows away from the room because I couldn't see Sally's car. I turned off the car and waited. I didn't want to, but I couldn't stop thinking about Sally and her children. It was about 5 p.m. when I noticed a familiar red pickup pull into a parking spot directly in front of Sally's room. John and Craig exited. They appeared joyful, smiling and chatting. They removed a few luggage and a cooler from the rear and entered the room next door. After about 45 minutes, they returned to the truck. I followed them for a few miles till they came to a place named Tapper's Pub. I parked on the street and watched as they went inside. Then I drove carefully around the lot and noticed Sally's car. I parked on the street so I could see the front door and John's red pickup. I considered stepping inside, but the pub appeared small and I was concerned about being seen. I sat there, listening to an old country music station and a playlist of mournful songs about lost love. It matched my mood. The four of them ultimately left the bar after 9 p.m., laughing and joking while holding hands. Rather than trying to catch up with them, I chose to return to the hotel first. I assumed they wouldn't leave at this late hour. Because I was parked where I was able to get on the road before them. I waited approximately 15 minutes with my windows down, monitoring their rooms. Soon, both the pickup truck and Sally's automobile entered the parking lot. The four of them exited and congregated in front of the room, conversing and joking. I was close enough to see them clearly in the light above the door, but too far enough to hear their talk, only the occasional burst of laughter. They appeared to be having a nice debate over something. After a short period, John made a show of pulling a coin from his pocket. He flipped it into the air, caught it, and extended his hand out to show everyone which side was up. Some individuals rejoiced, others grumbled. Craig then gently drew Sally closer and gave her a lengthy kiss with a smile. Debbie grasped John's arm and brought him to the other room while giggling. The two couples entered their own rooms, turning back to wave at each other. I sat there, astonished by what was happening. What kind of game? Where are they playing? My mind was racing with concern about what might be happening in room 168. The voice I'd heard in my brain all week got louder, encouraging me to act. But what could I do? This was clearly not their first time. They seemed way too at ease with each other. I couldn't reverse what Sally had done. 10 years. 10 years of marriage and raising a family? She had heard all we had created together. I agree. What purpose would it serve now? I believed I had the answer. At the very least, knowing that I tried would let me sleep easier. Then John stepped out of Debbie's room, wearing only his shorts and a t-shirt. He held a drink in his hand. I checked my watch and realized I'd been staring at their door for more than an hour. John looked to see if anyone was observing. He then went over to Sally's room and knocked on the door. Craig emerged a few minutes later, wearing only trousers and no shirt or shoes. He closed the door behind him. The two of them spoke briefly, while John sipped his drink. Then they gave each other high fives. This time, John went into Sally's room while Craig entered Debbie's. Suddenly, I realized what had just happened. I lost it. Suddenly, I heard a powerful voice in my head cry, "Do something!" I felt a flood of rage sweep over me, and I couldn't hold back longer. I reached over to the other seat, got my driving gloves, and put them on. I got out of the car, focused, and walked rapidly to room 168. I covered the individuals with my left thumb and knocked twice with my right hand as the door began to open, and John inquired, "What are you doing, Craig?" My fist surged forward, slamming into John's nose with vehemence. John's head snapped back, and he tripped 2 steps before collapsing hard on the floor. He sat there with only his boxer shorts on and his eyes shut, hands over his face, blood trickling between his fingers. He moaned and swayed back and forth. I gazed around the room, noting the cluttered bed and the slightly open bathroom door. I could hear the shower running. I took a few steps forward and booted John hard in a sensitive area. He sprang slightly off the ground and let out a loud, high-pitched scream. He collapsed to his side and curled up, clutching himself. I got over him and turned him on his back. I rolled up my pant leg and took the knife from where it was kept. John's nose was mainly twisted to one side. Blood dripped from his chin down his chest. To grab his attention, I lightly touched the knife handle against his shirt nose. He grumbled before cautiously opening his eyes. His eyes widened as he noticed the knife moving in front of him. I grabbed a fistful of his hair and he gasped as I yanked his head back. He pressed the tip of the knife slightly under his left eye. "How long?" "John? How long has this been happening?" I inquired quietly but angrily as I traced the knife along his cheek. "Do not lie to me now." I spoke in a chilly tone. 2, perhaps 2 years. He stuttered, anxiety palpable in his voice and eyes. I hesitated, carefully moving the point of the knife back and forth. "So joining the same racquetball league was not a coincidence, was it, John?" "No, no," he said hoarsely, closing his eyes in anguish again. I thought about it for a bit. He wished to be near the man whose wife he was seeing. "John, you're totally messed up." I shook his head by his hair, hoping to get him to look at me again. "Look at me, John." She was drying her hair with a towel when she spotted me. Her eyes widened in surprise, and she gasped, turning pale. As she stood there, dumb from shock, the towel dropped from her hands. I grabbed John's hair and lifted his head slightly before smashing it back to the floor. I stood up fast, and he groaned and curled back up. John boy seemed to be out of it. I spoke to her quietly, still clutching the knife. I confronted my wife. She was damp and defenseless. Despite having 3 children, she breathed quickly and maintained a lovely shape. The sole indication of her parenthood was a slight bulge above her nicely cropped hair. She frequently mentioned how hard she worked on her stomach, performing sit-ups and workouts, but she believed she'd never be able to get rid of that small lump. I often kissed her lightly, sliding my lips lower to express my gratitude for everything she had done for our family and the lovely life we enjoyed. However, something else made me even angrier. I noticed colorful marks on her breast and thighs, as well as one just above her left boob. I remembered that these kinds of marks would remain on her skin for days. This could explain why she avoided being seen without clothes for a while following her excursions. I scowled at her before taking a step toward the restroom. She looked afraid and took a fast step back, slamming the door firmly with both hands. I heard a click as she locked it. I turned and walked up to the nightstand beside the bed. I grabbed the phone and swiftly cut the wire with a knife, then returned the knife to its proper location. I turned and approached the front door. As I walked past John, I kicked him hard in the side. I heard a loud crack, then he let out a quick shriek, followed by a long groan. I paused at the door and took one last glance around the room. I screamed angrily and threw my phone at the bathroom door with all my power. It struck the door hard and dropped to the ground, causing someone within to yell in astonishment. I stepped out and slammed the door behind me. I paused for a time, realizing that there was still more to do. I strolled over to the next hotel room again. I covered the people with my left thumb and knocked twice with my right hand. The door opened, and Craig began to speak with a giggle. "You guys are really noisy." When my hand struck him just under the chin, he went straight back, landing hard on the floor. He laid there still. I quickly moved forward and kicked him hard. He continued to remain motionless and silent. I heard a quick cry from the bed and turned up to see Debbie sitting against the headboard. Her eyes were wide as she held a sheet up under her chin. I knelt alongside Craig and checked his pulse. A small trickle of blood flowed from the corner of his mouth, and his jaw hung loosely. He was still alive, but he was out cold. I rose up and walked over to the nightstand beside the bed. Debbie let go of the sheet and let it fall to her waist. Her trembling hands covered her mouth, and her terrified eyes watched me from behind her fingers. "Are you all right, Debbie?" I questioned, staring down at her. I saw a mark on her arm and wondered whether it signified anything. Then I took up the phone and pulled the cord from the wall. I stepped back to the entrance and turned to face her. "If you tell your husband you saw me tonight, simply tell him I said hello." I replied with a grin. Then I changed my mind and replied, "Or perhaps I'll say it myself." I dropped the phone in the corner of the room and walked out, locking the door behind me. I stood outside, staring up at the night sky and taking a deep intake of chilly air. I felt the tension leave me, replaced by a pleasant drowsiness. The anxious voice in my head was gone. It was over, and I knew what had to happen next. The only thing I could do on purpose. I walked to my car to begin the next chapter of my life. Yes. I answered the phone, sounding somewhat sharp. I was irritated by the interruption, despite having waited all morning for it. I had been lost in thinking about Jason, Jesse, and Allie. They were now the most significant aspect of my life. My major concern now was figuring out how to shield them from the consequences of what had occurred. "Phil, this is Jack." "Yes, Jack," I responded with little interest. "What's happening over there?" "Sally was at our house when her mother and I returned from church. She's quite upset and refuses to go home," Jack said, sounding enraged. I checked the time. It was almost 1 p.m., about 14 hours after I had left Rochester Hills. "I'm not sure why she would feel that way." I responded plainly. "She informed me that you were rough with a couple of Debbie's pals, whom she ran into last night." "You really wounded them?" Jack exclaimed, his voice rising. "Hurt them?" They should be grateful that I did not do worse, I replied with a sarcastic tone. Phil, what are you saying? That does not sound like you. I took a moment to consider how to answer. I finally asked him a question of my own. Did Sally tell you where the fight occurred? She stated that incident was outside a restaurant near Rochester Hills. She looked to be trying to twist the story. Her family, her account of events. Sally is your daughter, so I suppose it's correct. I responded slowly. There was silence on the line, and I could tell Jack was processing everything. Phil, I am bringing Sally home. I'd like to figure out what's happening. We need to talk. That is okay. I was not going anywhere. Jack abruptly ended the call, but I heard someone in the background exclaim, No, Daddy, no. I exhaled. I knew it would not be easy. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping my second drink, while flipping through some old photos and souvenirs from my shoebox, when they arrived. Jack strolled into the kitchen, followed by Sally, who tugged his arm. Please, Daddy, let us figure this out. Phil and I need to be alone. I paid close attention to Sally. She had no makeup on. Her hair was messed up and her eyes were red and puffy. She was shivering nervously. She wouldn't look at me as she grasped her father's arm and tried to steer him back toward the door, but Jack would not move. He stood in front of the kitchen table, staring at me. He stared silently at me and the knife next my beer. He finally spoke up. Okay, Phil, what's happening? I gave Sally a teasing glance. Come on, Sally. Explain this to your father. She turned to me, her tone stern. Be quiet, Phil, she said. You and I can work this out. But her eyes indicated that she hoped I would understand. I was annoyed that she felt we could cure everything if we were alone or that she assumed she could push me around. So I determined to be as honest as she had been. Tricky. And she was the one who got her parents engaged in this. I looked Jack directly in the eyes and said, I discovered that Sally and her employer, Debbie, enjoy spending time with friends when they are gone. I completely disagreed with this. I was quite firm about it. Sally gasped and sat down in one of the kitchen chairs. Jack glanced at me in disbelief. No, Philip. Sally would not do that. I do not believe you. I paused for a time before returning to Sally and asking, Show us the truth, Sally. What? What? She said, appearing perplexed. You have heard me. What is wrong? Your father has seen you without clothing before. It will not surprise him. Sally simply stared at me, unable to move. Jack shook his head, as if unable to believe what I was saying. I shrugged and replied, Okay, Sally. Let us try this another way. Please take off your blouse. Only that piece. Sally stood immobile, a terrified expression on her face. Jack began to get irritated with me. He remarked, That is enough, Phil. You are being mean and rude. My glance flickered from Sally to Jack, then back to Sally. I could feel my rage pushing away my sadness. Mean and disrespectful, you say? Not even close, Jack. Let me explain what is actually harsh and disrespectful. If Sally removed her blouse, you'd see what I saw last night in her room. Marks on her skin and a bruise above her right boob caused by another man, I said in a bland voice. Jack swiftly turned to face Sally. The dread on her expression proved I was telling the truth. Jack sank in his chair, as if he couldn't support himself any longer. His face was crushed as he pressed his hands to it and said, Oh no, this will really hurt your mother. Sally's face turned white and tears filled her eyes. Please, Daddy, don't tell Mom we can fix this with Phil, okay? Please, Phil, just please, she begged. I sat quietly, going through old photographs and fiddling with trinkets from my old box. I remembered a period when I felt severely hurt. After a few moments, Jack sat up straight and wiped his tears. He gazed at me without emotion. What will you do, Phil? He inquired as tears streamed down Sally's cheeks. I considered that question for a time. Finally, I spoke gently. I never talked to either of you about Vietnam or ripcord. I sighed and continued. Really? I never informed anyone about ripcord, including my therapist. I motioned to the pile of stuff on the table. Isn't it odd, Jack, that your generation openly displays military relics, whilst my generation hides them in a shoebox in the back of a drawer? Why do you believe that is? I asked. I saw an old photograph of two young men with sunburned skin, wearing loose jungle garments and dog tags around their necks. They smiled at the camera as if their trip to Vietnam had been nothing but enjoyable. Was I ever so young? I certainly felt older now. I placed the photo on the table between Jack and Sally and began speaking as if I were talking to strangers. Jason and I were left off at Ripcord in May 1971. It was simply one of many bases to which our unit had been sent. We would be flown in with our artillery set up and fire our weapons to assist the men in the jungle before moving on to the next location, after 1 or 2 months. We had been in Vietnam for 6 months and had another 6 months before we could return home. This time, though, things were different. We landed on a bare ridge surrounded by dense, gloomy vegetation. It overlooks a tiny valley near the border with Laos. The valley caused problems for the U.S. soldiers. In previous years, it had witnessed numerous violent confrontations with severe losses. Ripcord Fire Support Base was established to assist 4 battalions of the 101st Airborne Division. They were out in the mountains on both sides of the shore, attempting to prevent the North Vietnamese Army from reaching the coast via the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Unfortunately, it turned out to be a difficult task. Our battery of large guns, a battery of smaller guns, a group of mortars, and a company of soldiers were stationed at the fire base to provide protection. We had 2 helicopter landing areas and a couple companies of support personnel. There are probably only about 400 of us at any given moment. Almost the entire base was underground, with bunkers, trenches, and tunnels. Later, we discovered we were encircled by more than 12,000 regular North Vietnamese Army personnel. I stared at Jack with grief. Doesn't this remind you of anything, Jack? Like your Marines in the Chosun Reservoir? Jack nodded slowly and appeared to drift off, recalling a different time and location. I took a moment to gather my thoughts and memories. The first 6 weeks were not too awful for us, but the troops stationed on the hilltops around us were suffering greatly. We were continually supporting them. From the morning till the evening, helicopters flew in and out. At first, we simply had to cope with sniper fire and automatic gun bursts. However, when the helicopters approached to land, they were met by a barrage of anti-aircraft fire. Then, on July 1st, everything changed, just about 7 a.m. We were hit with mortar fire for the first time. During the first week, the North Vietnamese troops fired approximately 20 to 30 mortar rounds at us per day. After a while, they started employing even larger mortars, 120 millimeter. These were formidable weapons that had never been utilized below the DMZ previously. The challenging aspect was that with the wind blowing across the valley and all of the noise from the helicopters and our own artillery fire, it was difficult to hear when the mortars were approaching. One day that first week, I was sprinting from the mess hall to the fire direction control bunker when a mortar blast threw me off balance. I sprang up and dashed to the FDC bunker as quickly as I could. As I pressed myself against the wall to gather my breath, Jace looked up from his desk and casually commented, "Wow, Phil, you're bleeding." He was accurate about my hurry to rush to safety. I'd left my flak vest behind. I learned my lesson that day. A piece of shrapnel had struck me just below the right shoulder blade. When I eventually arrived at the aid station, the doctor examined my condition and determined that it was better to transport me to Camp Evans, our supply base, for adequate treatment. Within an hour, I was on my way there. They successfully removed the shrapnel, but they also diagnosed me with a concussion. They wanted to keep me for a few days to make sure everything was well. By the time I returned to Ripcord, anyone who ventured outside was certain to be hit by shrapnel. The bombing became increasingly severe as the days passed. We had more than just mortars. We also faced rocket-propelled grenades and other strong weapons. By the end, we were being hit with 70 to 80 rounds every day. More and more of our people were becoming injured. Our guns were constantly firing. We had to aim our howitzers virtually directly up since the targets were so close. Sometimes our troops would deplete their ammunition in just 3 or 4 hours. Large helicopters known as Chinooks flew in with supplies. They carried pallets of ammo suspended on stout ropes while under fire from opposing weapons. They'd drop the supplies without landing and then leave as soon as possible. Anyone who could would rush to the landing area and begin hauling shells and boxes of powder for our rifles. I had a few additional minor shrapnel wounds while completing this work. The incessant sound of explosions, along with our normal jobs and lugging supplies for the cannons, made us extremely fatigued all the time. We heard many jets overhead, including F-4 Phantoms and B-52 bombers, beginning strikes on neighboring hills. The explosions caused smoke to flood the area, and we occasionally had to contend with tear gas used by the enemy, which made breathing difficult. After July 8th, when we first noticed the enemy nearby, we remained on alert virtually every night. Everyone knew it was only a matter of time until they attempted to attack our campsite. We were all tense, waiting for the moment to arrive. As the bombings continued day after day, we began to endure terrible injuries and deaths. Our emotions fell because we felt ignored. By the end, we would have lost nearly 500 pals, either dead or injured. I had to transport corpse bags and stretchers to the helicopter landing location numerous times. On July 18th, the worst thing occurred. A Chinook helicopter carrying artillery munitions was shot at and crashed. It dropped directly on top of the 105 battery and their supplies. The area exploded like fireworks. The thunderous bangs and fires lasted several hours. All 6 cannons were destroyed. Several people were murdered, and many were injured. We were all in shock. When the Chinook crashed, I stared at Jack through tears. Many of us rushed to assist at the battery. Some of the victims were burned when the fuel caught fire. Jason. I bent down to assist one soldier and lifted him onto a stretcher. When the skin on his arm I was holding peeled off in my hands, I will not forget that. Or the burning odor, I replied quietly. Jack gave me a stern look, while Sally appeared afraid. I took a big breath and continued on. We all realized the building was too small for so many people, but the higher-ranking officials didn't get it. They only wanted to hurt the enemy. We had about 4 regiments of NVA all together in one location, I said fiercely. We were again on alert a few nights later. Automatic gunfire, as well as regular bombardment, could be heard all around us. Jason and I took up positions alongside an M60 machine gun in a tiny trench in front of the command bunker, bracing for a major attack. Our mortar team blasted flares into the sky to light the area, and our infantry company returned fire at the jungle's edge. Gunships sailed overhead every few minutes, firing rockets and miniguns at probable enemy locations. Usually, Jason, I didn't shoot back because there was a 3-man infantry team around 20 or 30 yards ahead of us. Shooting back often drew unwelcome attention to our location. That night, the infantry was regularly firing M79 grenades and automatic rifles into the undergrowth. They would occasionally receive return fire from the jungle. Suddenly, a group of 120mm mortar shell landed near the infantry position in front of us. Jason. I swiftly slid to the bottom of our trench as the ground rocked. Bewildered, we peered over the side and discovered that the infantry trench had collapsed. Nobody was coming out. We hastened to set up the 60, and Jace began firing back as I handed him the ammunition. Our sergeant crawled over to us, and we rapidly explained what had happened to our team and why we needed additional ammunition. He nodded, stooped low, and dashed straight to the operations center. We were nearly out of ammunition when I heard firing from an M16. I felt like someone had hit me hard in the back and legs with a bat. I leaned against the trench side and stared into Jason's eyes. The blood was all over us. And the machine gun. A gunshot had passed through the back of his neck and exited his throat. I was unable to move, and I could see the clarity in his eyes as he comprehended what was happening. He attempted to say something, but nothing came out. I grabbed for his hand, and he immediately squeezed it. Then, as the light faded from his eyes, I realized he was gone. I looked up at Jack and Sally, but it was as if I didn't notice them. Tears streamed down my face. My dearest buddy in the world was gone, my brother in every aspect but blood. I felt really alone. I am very alone. I spoke in a weak voice. I wiped my tears and tried to remain steady. I could hear Sally sniffling. I wasn't sure if she was crying for Jesus or for her own worries. Finally, I moved on. I found it difficult to swivel my head to look back. About 10 feet away from the bunker was Corporal Tran, pointing an M16 at us. He was a Kit Carson scout of the 101st. The majority of the scouts were North Vietnamese who had quit the army for a variety of reasons. Tran spoke quite decent English and assisted with translation when the forces apprehended captives or discovered enemy documents. He had taken refuge in our bunker several times during the shelling, and we had enjoyed some meals together. One night, Jace began teaching him how to play poker for fun. Many of the scouts felt anxious when things turned tense. They were worried about getting caught. They realized that if that happened, they would face a perilous fate. A few days ago, some scouts had been imprisoned in a bunker. As the crisis worsened, their actions became increasingly suspect, and we couldn't trust them. I wasn't sure if Tran was simply terrified or if he was pretending to be one of us. In the end, it wasn't important. Tran fired a full clip at Jason and me. I was hit several times, but my protective jacket spared me from major injury, except for a few broken ribs and a significant bruise. One bullet passed into the back of my thigh, but mercifully missed the bone as I began to feel faint. It hit me hard that Jace was truly gone and I'd been hurt. I tried to remain awake. I knew if I passed out, I might not live. I started telling myself to grow angry, to focus on my enemy, and to plan my retribution. My surroundings appeared to grow red as my wrath intensified, and I was filled with rage. Tran spotted my movement and attempted to shoot me again, but fortunately he had already expended all of his ammunition. I fell and feigned to be dead. Tran must have thought I was finished when he dropped his rifle and jumped over our trench. He began waving a flashlight and shouting in Vietnamese towards the jungle on the opposite side of the barrier. I struggled to kneel and see what he was doing. Suddenly, a rocket-propelled grenade emerged from the woods, leaving a twisting trail of smoke and mist. Both of us detonate behind us. Tran was leaping around, swinging his flashlight like if he'd lost his mind from the flares. I saw 3 people in khakis and helmets emerge from the jungle and sprint towards the barrier. As they approached, I noticed the unique bags hanging around their necks, as well as the pistols they were carrying. It was obvious they were sappers, a deadly group. I pulled on the huge machine gun under Jace. It was slick with blood, and I strained to keep my footing, but I was able to lift it and aim at them. I knew I had to stop them before they got through our barriers. I fired 2 long bursts until the gun was out of ammo. I wasn't sure if I had hit them, but the 3 sappers tumbled down. Tran turned around and looked at me with disbelief. He yelled at me, his wrath palpable, as he reached for the machete hanging from his belt. Many scouts carried these to cut through the dense bush while on patrol. Just in time, I got my good leg over the trench edge and lifted myself up as Tran lunged at me. I dropped the machine gun and swiftly removed my dagger from its sheath, prepared to defend myself. I dived beneath the swinging machete, and we faced each other. I felt my knife go into him just below his waist, and his eyes widened in surprise. He did not appear to slow down. He kept beating my head with the machete handle, shouting loudly as we wrestled together. I eventually pulled out my knife, and he stumbled back, knocking me down with him. Dizzy and bleeding from the head, I found myself on top of him. He worked hard to push me away and fight back with the machete. With one final effort, I grasped his throat with my left hand. I raised the knife high in my right hand and rammed it into his left eye with all my might. He yelled, shook once, and lay motionless. I just sat there, unable to breathe, clutching his neck and feeling the warm blood rush through my hands. I'm not sure how long I was there. The light from the flares flickered down, and I could hear the loud booms of shells exploding, the dazzling flashes of bullets zipping by overhead, and the massive guns thundering. The stench of gunpowder, blood, and smoke permeated the air, and I felt imprisoned in a nightmare. Then, out of nowhere, my platoon sergeant Eric grabbed one of my arms, while our officer, Lieutenant Dixon, seized the other. I gripped the knife tightly, feeling as if my life was on the line. They began pushing me back as Dixon yelled for me to rush to the bunker because planes were about to drop napalm on our location, and we were too close to danger. I paused in my story, sipped my drink, and used the point of the knife to push about the 3 Purple Heart medals on the table. I rearranged them repeatedly, adjusting the arrangement as I go. Jack and Sally were quiet, barely breathing. I was too impatient to look at them. At last I spoke again. After that I fainted. When I awoke, I was in a medical room with an IV in my arm. The Army doctor and one of the medics were caring for me. The doctor stated I would probably be fine and that they would transport me away as soon as the helicopters could arrive at daylight. They finally let me out around midday, which felt great. Each chopper that arrived met intense fire. 2 had already been shot down. The chopper I was on was hit. 2, including 1 gunshot that injured the crew chief. But that morning, the decision was made to evacuate Ripcord. I later learned that they evacuated everyone on the 21st and then bombarded the region. I shrugged, but it no longer mattered to me. I was on a plane to a hospital in Japan in less than a day. I stayed there for a week before being transferred to Walter Reed for an additional month. While I was there, a colonel who probably knew little about Ripcord stopped by to award out medals. They presented me with this trophy for conquering my adversaries. I reached into the box and removed a small piece of red, white, and blue fabric with a silver star on it. I put it on the table next to the Purple Hearts. It looked identical to the one in Jack's shadow box. The physicians helped me recuperate nicely, and I was informed that after a few months of therapy, I'd be okay. I shook my head, but I was not fine. Not in my mind, at least. I experienced nightmares every night and woke up yelling. I could not forget the sounds of danger, the scents, or the faces of the deceased and injured. I had missed Jason's burial, but I returned home on leave before traveling to Fort Sill. I started by visiting Jason's parents. It was the most difficult thing I had ever done. They wanted to know everything about Vietnam, what we were doing, and how Jace died. But they did not ask the single question. I kept wondering why I had survived, but he had not. I took a breath and said softly. I ask myself the same question practically every day. I glanced into the distance, remembering a sad period in my life. I was going to therapy, but I still wanted to hide from the world. I did not want to see or speak to anyone. I simply performed what I needed to do at Fort Sill to make everyone pleased. I got lost in some drafting classes in college, so I didn't have to hang out with the other men after school. When it came time for me to leave the service, I returned to live with my parents and continued my education. I didn't care about it, but I wasn't sure what else to do. I looked up to meet Sally's eyes. The pain and sadness of the night before nearly overcame me. And then I met Sally. I said softly. She fought back tears, glanced down at the table, and refused to meet my gaze. You returned me to the real world. You were happy and cared deeply about everyone and the world around you. You were stunning, both inside and out. Everything I thought I lacked. You made me want to get to know you. You inspired me to fully live anew and showed me what my life may look like. I fell in love with you. You saved me, and you gave me 3 amazing children. I'll always be grateful for that, I said with a sense of longing. We sat there silently for a few minutes. Finally, Jack cleared his throat and asked softly, "What now?" Phil. Tired, I turned to face him. "Jack, I've been hurt twice in my life. Each time I lost my best friend, I stated plainly. Sally buried her face in her hands and began to wail, whispering, "No, no, no." The three of us sat silently. Sally was crying, and Jack and I were also in tears. Jack spoke softly. "Are you certain, Phil? Do you really want to toss everything away because of one mistake?" Sally looked up, her eyes bright with anticipation. I knew what I had to say would harm our marriage, but I couldn't keep it hidden. I shook my head and confronted him. "Just one error, Jack. It wasn't a single mistake. I discovered last night that Sally has been unfaithful to me for nearly 2 years. There was more than one man involved." Sally gasped, closed her eyes, shook her head in grief, and sank back into her chair, her complexion even paler than before. I stared at her with fascination. "Did not John tell you, Sally, that he had admitted everything?" Then I turned to Jack. "Does this address your question?" I questioned. And Jack slowly stood up and looked at Sally with a troubled heart. "You are my daughter. Therefore I must love you, but I have lost all respect for you. Your acts are." Jack paused, seeking to find the appropriate words before just shaking his head. Sally reached out with one hand, hoping to touch him, but he pulled back. He looked at me and said firmly, "Phil, you don't deserve this. You do what you have to do, but just do not hurt her." I couldn't bear to witness that. "No, Jack, I'm pretty much finished with that." I responded sadly, "But if it helps you, take it." I returned the knife to its cover and handed it to him. Jack accepted it without comment and turned towards the door. His shoulders drooped. I could tell he was concerned about how he would inform Emily. As the door closed, the phone started ringing, but neither of us looked at it. We just sat there quietly, without moving or talking, and avoided each other's eyes. The ringing soon stopped, making the silence feel even more intense. Finally, I spoke, peering into the horizon. "I expected the cops would accompany you this morning, not your father." Sally cringed at my remarks and spoke hesitantly. "Debbie and I got them to make up a narrative about getting attacked outside a bar. We assumed if they kept it a secret, you wouldn't tell their wives. After giving it some thought, I realized I was fine. There was no way they could revise their tale and yet have people trust them." For a brief moment, it felt as if a weight had been taken off of me. But then I remembered how everything else was collapsing around me. I simply groaned and asked, "So, where are they now?" Sally cleared her throat and shuffled in her seat anxiously. "They are still in the hospital undergoing observation. You harmed them severely. John has shattered his nose, cheekbone, and ribs. Craig had a dislocated jaw, several damaged teeth, and a concussion," I stated directly. "Don't forget about the other injuries, Sally." Sally stared at me with fear and concern in her eyes. "No, no, you caused terrible harm to them." She paused for a bit. "I've never known you to be this way." "Phil, did you really need to go that far?" I looked at her in bewilderment. "Are you actually protecting those people?" I asked, trying to sound amusing. Before she could respond, the phone rang again. "You should take it up. It is probably for you," I said, getting up and going to the restroom. I cleansed my face and glanced in the mirror. My eyes were red and puffy. I appeared exhausted and worn out, older than I actually was. When I returned to the kitchen, I hadn't slept too well the night before. Sally just stood there, staring at the phone in her palm. She slowly hung it up and slid into one of the kitchen chairs as I sat down, without looking at me. "Did you really need to notify Debbie's husband?" I shrugged and responded. Why shouldn't I share the pain? He had previously called John and Craig's wife, and now he has kicked Debbie out of their home. She needs to hire a lawyer just to visit her own daughter. Sally began crying again and repeating, "Oh no, oh no." She glanced up at me, tears streaming down her face, and whispered, "I fired you." She stated it was entirely my responsibility. I gave out a sour laugh. "That's absolutely wonderful. Sally, tell me who introduced you to John and Craig. It was Debbie, right? Sally asked between her sniffles. How did you know? I informed Josh this morning about what you and Debbie did last night. He did not want to believe me. He labeled me a liar and claimed I was trying to end his marriage. However, when I mentioned John Harrison, he transformed entirely. He turned pale and started swearing. I believe it was the first time he became extremely angry in his life. You told me years ago that Debbie had been married before and was not close to her parents. Debbie has a sister, Sarah, who lives far away in another area of the state. They don't see each other often. About a year ago, Josh was conducting a business review in Sarah's area. While there, he met Sarah, who was working on the same project. Sarah knew Debbie had remarried, and Josh knew Debbie's sister, but they had never met. They got along well, and one evening, before Josh finished his work, Sarah invited him to supper with her and Dave. Sarah told an intriguing anecdote. She disclosed that her husband, Dave, was previously married to Debbie. They began dating in college and remained together for 2 years, until Debbie graduated. Following that, they married on their first anniversary. Dave learned that Debbie had been unfaithful. He was upset when he found out she had been seeing someone during their relationship. He stopped the marriage and filed for divorce. Debbie's relationship with her parents suffered as a result. Following their divorce, Dave and Sarah began dating and eventually married. They now have a few children and appear to be extremely happy. Of course, Debbie never told Josh about all of this, and guess who Debbie was with during her previous marriage? Surprise! It was John Harrison. I halted, and Sally stared at me in disbelief. Oh, absolutely. When I revealed John's name, Josh began to connect the pieces and realized that Debbie had been unfaithful to him, just as you were to me. No surprise he kicked her out. And like Josh. I wonder how long you've been disloyal to me, I replied strongly. Sally began crying again, saying, Oh, God, Phil, it was only John and Craig, and it happened during our shopping trips. Please believe me when I say I never thought about anyone else until Debbie brought it up before our first shopping excursion. She sat there, wringing a handkerchief between her fingers and alternating between crying and pleading. Please, Phil, I'm not sure how I landed up here. I felt as if I had just awoken from a nightmare. When I opened the restroom door and noticed you standing there, I didn't say anything. I simply stared at her with a serious expression. When she saw my look, she began speaking quickly, almost as if she was afraid. I knew Debbie enjoyed having fun before we started shopping together. She often mentioned how much she cherished those moments throughout her marriage, but I didn't expect her to meet anyone on our trip. I was astonished when John entered the restaurant and Debbie introduced him to me. She mentioned that she knew John from high school and that he was simply visiting the region. I found that unusual, but I kept it to myself. She paused, biting her lip and turning away. That night, John was really nice. He was flirting, dancing with both of us, and showering me with praises. I had a couple more beers than normal, and when his hands moved slightly on the dance floor, I feigned not to notice. When we returned to the hotel, Debbie accompanied John. He had rented the room next to ours. I realized Debbie had planned this. The motel was older and had thin walls, so I could hear them all night. Debbie was quite loud. Listening to them got me really enthusiastic. That's probably why you were so into things when you got home that Sunday, right? I replied, feeling a little nauseous. Sally glanced down and nodded. She dried her eyes and continued. John left the next morning. We went to breakfast and Debbie told me everything about their night together. She couldn't stop chatting about him on the way home. Debbie and I ate lunch together at work a couple of times per week over the next few months. She regularly mentioned John and how much fun she had with him. That was when I first learned about his ward. Debbie playfully told me that I needed to see it for myself because she couldn't explain it. At first, I simply shrugged it off. But the more she mentioned it, the more I thought about it. When it came time to go shopping again, Debbie told me that John was really interested in me and that she didn't mind if I spent time with him. I laughed it off again, but then asked her what she would do if I did. She explained that John had a buddy named Craig who would be there to keep her company. I did not say no, although I'm not sure why. I told her I'd think about it, but I didn't think I could follow through. Sally gazed at me, and I stared back at her without emotion. I knew it was bad, Phil, but the thought crossed my mind that I could do it and no one would know. Sally averted her gaze once more and explained that John and Craig arrived at the restaurant on Saturday night. We had supper and a few beers. Then we headed to a nightclub. We formed pairs, and I partnered with John. By then, I'd had plenty to drink and assured myself everything was all right. Everyone was having fun. When we returned to the motel, John and I went to our own rooms, while Debbie and Craig went to theirs. Sally paused speaking and looked down at her hands. I finally asked, little frustrated, "So, was it all you expected?" Sally glanced at me with tears in her eyes. "It was okay. It was not much better than what you and I had. It was excited since it felt incorrect, and was with a new person. I enjoyed pretending to be someone else. So you're admitting it was better than okay. It caused you to forget about your husband at home. Your husband was caring for our children because he loves you. So you may take some time for yourself." I said this in rage. Sally fought back tears and averted her gaze once more. "Yes," she whispered. "So what about Craig?" "My wife?" I asked sarcastically. Without looking at me, she responded. After a few travels with John, Debbie joked that she began to miss him. I didn't think much of it, but on the next trip, when we were paired off, I ended up dancing all night with Craig. Craig later came to my motel room where we spent the night together. It didn't seem like a huge deal. Then, a few trips later, something changed. John and Craig swapped partners in the middle of the night. I hadn't realized it at first. Late at night, I awoke to discover that the man with me was not the one I had started with. Sally stared at me with despair. I felt like I was living two separate lives. I adore our lives together, you, me, and the children. But I was lured to those weekend getaways. I imagined I could live both lives and you'd never know. How foolish was I? Very foolish. I spoke back to her. After you caught me in the motel, I glanced in the mirror and saw who I had become. She whispered nearly to herself. I stood up and gazed down at her. "Sally, this is an interesting story. Too bad there isn't a happy ending. Or maybe it works for you. I'm going to concentrate on the children now. Tonight, after Allie falls asleep, you and I will sit down with Jason and Jesse and inform them that their parents will be living separately. I believe Allie is still too little to understand. We will not explain everything to them. I'll do my best not to damage them too much. For the time being, I'll sleep on the basement couch until I can locate a more suitable location." Sally yelled at me as I started walking away. "Phil? Oh my. This was a mistake. I love you. Please do not do this." I turned and asked, "Why not?" Sally, crying hard, said. "It was just 3 or 4 evenings per year. I never saw John, Craig, or anyone else except on those weekends. Please, Phil, I implore you. Can't you forgive me and allow me to repair this? Do you forgive me?" Sally: "Forgive you for spending 3 or 4 nights per year with other men, for giving up what I cherished the most, which means you've forgiven me for betraying your trust. Forgive me for doubting that we were meant to be. And how would you solve it? Can you go back and change something? Could you not choose between John and Craig this time? Because that's what it would take to put things right?" I spoke tiredly. I stood silently, taking in the kitchen. I observed family portraits on the wall, as well as children's paintings and papers fastened to the refrigerator. Allie's booster seat is in the corner. These were the features that made this house feel like a home. I shook my head, attempting to clear my thoughts. I spent the majority of the night awake, thinking how I would feel about you in 6 months, a year, or even 5 years. I know I may be able to forgive you someday, but I will never forget. Not in a year, 5 years, or even 10. Every time I see you, I'll think of what occurred last night. Every time I hear your voice, I shall recall it. And every time I hear your name, it brings back memories. I spoke in a weak voice, tears in my eyes. I stated that Sally is something I cannot bear. I remained there, motionless, feeling sorry about what was to come. I scarcely noticed Sally shaking in her seat, weeping and muttering. No, thanks. No. After a few minutes, I spoke softly. Can you answer one of my questions, Sally? She stared up at me with blank eyes, as if she understood there was no more hope. You lost the one who cared the most about you. You ruined your parents' pride. My parents are proud, as is your husband. You've lost your job. And one day, you'll have to explain to our children why our family split apart. Was it worthwhile? After a silent time interrupted only by Sally's gentle cries, I turned and walked out the door. Here's the next story. Everything used to be wonderful. I reflected to myself as I lay in bed, cradling my favorite teddy blue bear, Leo, closely against my breast with crossed arms. It had been 3 rough years for me. My parents had been married 10 years, living a regular and happy family life. Then everything began to unravel. A bit of bickering turned into full-fledged yelling battles. Any trace of that wonderful family has vanished. I had no idea how things had gotten so bad. It was not anything I could anticipate or expect. It appeared to build like a storm off the coast. Little drips of rain turned into a torrential downpour, accompanied by the smashing thunder of broken dishes and curses. I laid there, chin nestled into my chest, nuzzling my nose into Leo's fluffy head. I heard my mother cry again. This time it was because my father was unable to travel the 6-hour distance for a visit he had planned months ago. It was probably work-related. I became desensitized to the rising number of explanations. I didn't care anymore. I'd spoken with my father on the phone twice in the last 2 years and seen him once. I didn't expect him to arrive. My mother had a different narrative. You never know how much a woman may change when she loses the man she loves and her heart is broken. Emma was always more unhappy that she wouldn't get to see my father than that he cared enough to come see me. Even after 3 years, she remained in love with him. When he went, she tried to fill the vacuum with light by drinking wine with dinner and going out for drinks with friends on occasion. In my opinion, they were all perfectly typical adult behaviors. When things began to worsen, I realized my mother was having a problem. 1 glass of wine at night led to several glasses during the day. Going out for a drink once a week has evolved into not going out once a week. The drinking had ceased 2 years ago. Emma learned that my father had remarried at that point. The news arrived without warning. Just a phone call one day to say he had met someone a year ago. They had married in a tiny ceremony about a month ago, and that he was relocating 6 hours away with his new wife and their daughter. A love story condensed into a 5-minute phone call. I did not blame my father for keeping it hidden for the same reason. I didn't blame him for not making more of an effort to see me after the breakup. My mother was a different person, a lovely, warm woman who enjoyed baking chocolate chip cookies, coloring with crayons, and never swearing. That lady I knew as my mother had been replaced with an empty, cold woman who, when not enraged, was an emotionless zombie of a mother. However, my mother's decision to store the booze was not a blessing for me. The bottle has been replaced by a needle. I spotted the obvious indicators of narcotics usage immediately away, but I couldn't connect the dots and realized that's where they pointed. I noted her dramatic weight loss, the big bags beneath her eyes, and the fact that she never slept at night. Previously, my mother was constantly scolding at me over something, making me feel that my father's departure was my fault, making me feel like I had ruined her life. At least she stopped yelling and generally left me alone. While this wasn't the perfect life for me, I saw it as an improvement and assumed things would get better over time. Then, 4 months ago, my eyes opened. I came home from school and needed to use the restroom. The bathroom door was locked, and my mother was inside. "Mom, I have to use the restroom." I spoke through the wooden door. My mother responded in a panicked tone. "You are going to have to wait. I am busy in here." "Mom, I can't wait. I really had to go," I pleaded with her. Her urgent tone spat back. "Simply go away. Let me be. Go away." Like the majority of older homes, there is usually a technique for unlocking the bathroom door. I learned this skill a long time ago. I went into the kitchen, grabbed a butter knife, and returned to the locked door. With a deft flip of the wrist, I expertly jammed the blade between the door and its frame. I activated the mechanism, and the door gently swung open. I gazed at my mother, and the butter knife slipped from my limp fingers and dropped to the floor. My mother was sitting on the toilet, her back on the tank, legs and arms extended apart. On the center of her left arm, there was an untightened rubber tube on her forearm. Fresh needle marks appeared on the sink counter next to her, as did a needle, a bent blackened spoon, a lighter, and a small plastic baggie filled with white powdered residue. Emma attempted to reach out to me and offer some sort of explanation, but all she could muster was incomprehensible rambling. She dropped her hand in defeat, slid back against the toilet, and let her eyes roll into the back of her head as the hide took hold. I gazed, mouth wide open, unable to move, think, or feel. I observed my mother's unsuccessful attempt to explain. I saw the evidence, and despite being just 15 years old, I was far from stupid. I knew my mother had just injected heroin without making a sound. I reached up, grasped the restroom door handle, and gently closed it behind me. I moved step by step to my room. I crawled into bed, reached out, drew Leo's furry body against my own, rolled to my side, stared blankly at the wall, and started crying. It wouldn't be the last time I found comfort in the embrace of my blue bear, Leo, or in the solitude of staring at the wall during the next 4 months. Every time I saw my mother and realized she was high, I would slowly walk to my room, grasp Leo, and continue staring at the wall while sobbing. This would occur 3 or 4 times every week for the next 4 months. I'd walk into the kitchen, see my mother's drugged-out smile, and turn around to go to my room without saying anything. She never appeared to notice. Then again, she never seemed to notice anything these days, whether it was my poor grades, the letters from my instructors that arrived in the mail, or the black eye I brought home from a fight at school. Emma strolled about the home in a daze, completely unaware of her surroundings. Today would probably be no different. I was thinking to myself while walking home from school. I disliked school and returning home. I dreaded pretty much everything in my life. I hated the notion of returning home to discover my mother. Hello again. I knew her drug use had likely increased significantly in recent weeks. I was not irritated with her. I loved her more than anything in the world, and I was devastated that she was so broken within that she had to turn to drugs. I only wanted my mother back. As I approached my destination on the sidewalk, I made a turn and went to my front steps. I bit my lower lip. This is it. Let's see how high she is now, I thought to myself, considering the state of my drug-addicted mother. The doorknob turned gently as I opened the door and entered the house. It was silent inside, as it always was. Emma stopped listening to music and turned off the television months ago. I slipped my shoes off at the door and let my backpack fall from my shoulders to the ground. I closed the door behind me. "Mom, I'm home," I called out, as I did every day, hoping against hope that she would call me back as she used to. More than 3 years ago. Silence. I feared it. Usually she would respond half-heartedly, and the quiet suggested that she was preoccupied with her attempts to get high. I slowly walked from the front of the home to the kitchen. I noticed a piece of paper on the table with a snatch. I held it in my hand. Notice of eviction. All residents of this property are thus commanded to depart the premises within 10 days of receiving this letter. This was what I had feared. I feared Emma would spend all of her money on her drug habit. My fears had come true. We had less than a week to find a new home to reside. I wondered how much worse my situation might become. Then I noticed it from the corner of my eye. It was the toe of her slipper. It was jutting out from behind the large gray recliner in the living room. I hurried over to her position. Another worry had come true. She lay on her back on the living room carpet. Her skin is pale and colorless. Her eyes stared blankly into the air. A little gasp escaped my lips. My hand grabbed my mouth as I gazed at her body. My hand then moved to her mouth and nose. There was no breath. Then my fingertips landed on her wrist among the ancient track marks. There was no pulse to be felt. I then placed my palm on her forehead and felt the much too chilly skin. I gazed into her eyes and saw something I had not seen in 3 years. No rage, no heroin high. There's no sadness. I crawled beside her. I reached out, grabbed her hand, and pulled it into my chest. I rolled onto my side and stared blankly at the wall. I couldn't cry since I wasn't feeling anything. Large raindrops spilled on the top of the light gray casket. The irony of a rainy day burial was lost on me as I peered at the wooden box containing my departed mother. I observed the about 20 people who decided to attend the burial service. The small gathering that formed a semicircle around the casket was primarily made up of people from my neighborhood, with a few of Emma's old pals dispersed throughout. They had all known her in her prime. All of them appeared to have abandoned her during the last 3 years. She slid farther into her own particular void. I considered myself hypocritical. I could feel the resentment and contempt growing within me. Hatred was the only emotion I had felt since leaving her dead body. Being among this group of folks did nothing to change it. That feeling lingered within me as I reflected on the ones who ignored her when she needed them the most. Those who did not feel the need to try to save her from the vices that had destroyed her life. They did, however, appear when the demons eventually took it. Hatred is a powerful emotion, and I felt nothing but it for these people. The seed had been seeded 8 days before. After 2 hours, I left her side and went next door to inform my neighbor. That seed was carefully watered while the cops arrived at my house, roped it off, and grabbed the attention of the entire neighborhood. They all gaped and gazed. They passed their judgments and made disparaging remarks. They were there to watch her body carried out, wrapped in a thin white sheet. Nobody cared when she was alive, when she needed them the most. They all stood in the pew of righteousness, feeling better about themselves because they weren't the ones suffering. Damn them! I swore in my thoughts that the seed of hatred would sprout swiftly and flourish rapidly in the 8 days leading up to the funeral. I despised my father, John, who couldn't make the trip the day he got the news, forcing me to stay with neighbors I hardly knew and who clearly felt inconvenienced by my presence there. I despised my stepmother, Karen, and her daughter Lisa for going along. I and Emma had never met the two, but they pretended to care enough to attend the funeral. I had time to dislike other aspects of them after only meeting them for the first time 8 hours ago. I despised Karen's superficial phony smile when she met someone I despise. Lisa has nearly perfect blonde hair and gorgeous features, but she wears too much makeup for her 16-year-old face. Lisa was only a year older than me, but with her overdone makeup and revealing fashions, she appeared to be 19. I, with my dark brown hair and humble appearance, my baggy sweatshirts and out-of-date pants, was the polar opposite. Lisa's actions immediately made me loathe her. Hatred is an interesting concept. As I stood amid the burial attendants between my father and stepmother, all I could feel was hatred. It didn't matter that my deceased mother was about to be dropped into the grave. Emotions may be drugs. For 3 years, I was a regular user of sadness. When she died, sadness was no longer effective. I needed a hard drug. That drug was hate, and I was addicted. The drive to my father's place was excruciating. Lisa sat next to me, holding her trendy pink cell phone that slid open 3 different directions, and we had been conversing for 3 hours. If that was considered chatting, I had lost count of the amount of OMG and LOL spoken by my exuberant stepsister. It had also been a drive of meaningless, one-sided conversations with my stepmother. So far, we are pleased to have you living with us. Karen spoke to me with such phony politeness, it nearly gave me a cavity. I'm also happy. I said to my father the first words he had uttered to me since the burial. We had to alter Karen's doll room to make it into a bedroom for you. But it was no problem, my father remarked nicely. Not for you, perhaps, but try putting together a room for a teenage girl on such short notice. I did not have time to paint. I didn't have time to choose new drapes. I didn't have time to really decorate, not to mention finding an appropriate location for my offspring. My stepmother shot at my father. I mumbled, "Confused babies." Karen collects porcelain dolls and has a whole room full of them. It's okay, though. You needed the room more, my father informed me in the rearview mirror. I could see my stepmother roll her eyes at my father's final sentence. My father continued, "That's not much. A dresser and bed, a little nightstand, and a lamp. We'll work on making it more like you want it as you settle in. Perhaps decorate it with those funny puppies you adore. I haven't had any interest in pups since I was a child." I started to respond, but was very immediately interrupted by Karen exclaiming, "Puppies? John, please. No girl in my house will adorn her room with puppies." I had already planned some extremely current color patterns with Karen when I stopped listening. I could see my stepmother becoming excited about the interior decor of my new room. I didn't care, and drowned her out. The second 3 hours of the journey had been easier on me. Karen applied a thick cloth beauty mask and fell asleep. Lisa shifted from conversing on the phone to clicking away at the keyboard while listening to her bright pink iPod's white headphones. My father drove quietly, listening to the low drones of a sports discussion show on the radio. I studied my father in the mirror. The last 3 years had altered him. He was tanned and slimmer. He appeared to have lost his humorous, carefree personality, which I had come to expect. Growing up, it seemed to have been replaced with a heavy sense of gravity and a near alienation from everything and everyone around him. It was almost as if he was drowning out everything. "I miss Mom," I blurted out. I wasn't sure why I said it. I did not intend to say it. It just came out as soon as the words left my mouth. I felt dumb for saying that in this car with these folks, I agree. I heard my father speak solemnly. I stared at him in the rearview mirror. I noticed his eyes were filled with grief, the kind of melancholy you only experience after a terrible loss. Then I saw it. My father's eyes welled up with tears as a couple dropped to his shirt. He hastily massaged his eyes and went for the radio, turning up the volume. Perhaps I didn't detest him that much after all. I caught myself drifting off as we drove down my father's drive. There, road. I just realized that this was now my new street. Everything in my life was always changing, so that was a little surreal. The automobile traveled through a middle-class area with spotless white picket fences and finely maintained lawns. They came to a stop in the well-paved, light gray driveway. There was a basketball hoop to the left of the car. In front was a white door leading to a 2-door garage. A lovely 3-bedroom white house with navy blue shutters sat next to the garage. It looked like something from a magazine. Suburban paradise. I slung my canvas duffel bag over my shoulder as I got out of the car. It's astonishing how light the backpack was, considering it held everything I owned except one item. My blue fuzzy bear, Leo, was snuggled under my left arm as I approached the house down the concrete walkway. I grabbed him so tightly that if he was still alive, he would have suffocated by now, step by step. Slowly, I approached the navy blue front door. I stood immediately across from it, simply staring. Everything seemed so wonderful to me. The shutters and door matched well. The driveway was free of any cracks or blemishes. The grass was green, the sky was blue, and in the distance I could hear birds chirping. I'd been having a nightmare, and now I was standing in what appeared to be one. I was brought back to reality when Lisa ran past me, hard banging my shoulder, and sent me tumbling forward. I barely managed to keep my feet and avoid colliding with the concrete front step. "Why don't you and your foolish bear look out?" My stepsister spoke bitterly. I gathered myself and looked Lisa up and down. So many angry ideas raced through my head. For a brief period, the most dominant thought was to tear that gorgeous blonde hair from her skull. I had taken a break from that dark, personal realm of hatred, but it had returned, like an old acquaintance, with the same emotion boiling within me. I entered the house, managing to resist the impulse to inflict pain and suffering on my stepsister. I slammed the front door behind me, already cynical and skeptical that this new existence would be any better than the old. If looking at a wall was an Olympic event, I would be a gold medalist. I lay in my new room, a former den for porcelain dolls, staring at the beige wall. It had been 4 hours since I tossed my canvas duffel bag onto the foot of my new bed and laid down, hugging Leo and focusing solely on the wall. The room had normal size, however, it was only furnished with a twin-size bed, a little nightstand with a smaller lamp, and a cream-white dresser. It felt big, massive, and empty. Empty, like me. I reflected about my entry into the room 4 hours ago. Since then, I had lain motionless on top of a quilt. It was one of those quilts from a fancy home supply store that people overpay for because they believe it is truly created. I was immediately reminded of Karen because it was artificial and cheesy, as if she had tried far too hard to be something she wasn't, in an attempt to dazzle everybody. I have something to be thankful for in the preceding 4 hours. I was not concerned one moment. Not once did someone swing by to see how I was doing, if I needed anything, or just to check in. I was grateful. I didn't want to see, talk to, or be around anyone, particularly the individuals in this house. While my father wasn't bad, he reminded me too much of my late mother and how much my life had changed in just 3 years. The house's layout complemented my solitary desires. The front of the house included the living room, dining room, and kitchen. My father's, Karen's, and Lisa's bedrooms were all on the right side of the house. To the left of the house was a spacious bathroom, followed by the laundry room and my room. Lying in my bed, I was always at least 50 feet away from everyone. Mathematical plan. Equations like this kept my mind active as I stared at the wall. My peace was shattered when I heard a knock at the door. I was no longer alone. My father's voice rang through my door. "Lily, may I come in? Maybe he'll leave if I don't say anything." My voice pondered in my mind. "Lily, are you all right? Look, I understand you may not feel like doing much. Losing your mother was probably heartbreaking for you. I am here for you, Lily. We are heading out to a wonderful Italian restaurant in town. They have some excellent lasagna. I wish you will come, but I understand if you do not want to. The new house and everything is a lot to handle. Remember, Lily, I know we haven't spoken or seen one other in a few years, but you are still my little girl, and I love you. I am constantly." Karen's shouting voice abruptly interrupted my father's impassioned statement. "John, let's go or we'll miss our reservation." The intensity and tone of Karen's wail made me cringe in my bed. I could dimly hear my father's hand fall to the doorknob. At that point, a large part of me wished he would open the door, come in and hug me. That part of me wished for my father to hold me close as he had done when I was younger and assure me that everything would be well. But then the agony of truth called, or rather yelling, "John, get out of here now or we'll go without you," Karen yelled with such keen poison that I could hear the door handle tremble slightly as I realized my father's hand had fallen away and he was now retreating to Karen at the front of the house. In that moment, the part of me that longed for my father's love began to wither. And when I heard the front door close and the car drive away, leaving me alone in the home, it all but died. The sunshine filtered through the white drapes of my bedroom window and felt warm against my skin. I groggily lifted my head from my pillow and realized I'd fallen asleep. I glanced at the clock on my nightstand. I realized it had only been an hour since my father stood behind my door, bored, curious, and well aware that I would have the home to myself for at least another hour. I decided to leave my room as I opened the door and stepped out into the corridor. I instantly noted how many images were on the hallway walls. These were high-class photos of Karen and Lisa, and an occasional one of my father. They all matched the fashionable style of the rest of the property. I found myself appreciating a certain Lisa photo. He's incredibly attractive. She resembles a supermodel. I thought to myself as I studied the close-up of Lisa with her face in her hands. My eyes shifted focus, and I could see myself reflected in the picture frame's glass. I studied my ordinary brown eyes, which I believed were too large and round. I looked at my shoulder-length, untidy brown hair and round cheeks, which reminded me of a chipmunk, and immediately thought of Lisa's high cheekbones and feline, exotic-looking green eyes. I felt like a potato compared to a rose. Lisa's room entrance was visible just down the hall. I quickly proceeded down the corridor and hesitated in front of the door, debating whether or not to enter. It lasted 2 seconds, as I immediately turned the handle and softly pulled the door open without crossing the threshold. I could explore the entire room. Lisa's bedroom resembled a chic New York City studio apartment. Her bed was positioned at an angle 5 feet from the rear corner with a mahogany computer desk placed into the opposite far corner. It was decked with a pink laptop, stacks of notes, pens, and files. The entire room was painted in deep pink and light green. One item in particular attracted my attention. To the left of the entryway, between 2 large windows with light green curtains, was one of the most breathtaking vistas I'd ever seen. My gaze was suddenly fixed on a stunning white vanity. The base consisted of 3 drawers, followed by a shorter row on top. The top was adorned with a large oval mirror with lovely floral etchings around the glass. The complete vanity stood on 4 legs fashioned from top to bottom into wooden flowers. Without thinking, I took slow steps into Lisa's room, mesmerized by the exquisite furniture. As I neared the vanity, I stretched out and touched the ivory bench, as if I were approaching a hitherto unknown treasure, standing up front. The surface was smooth marble with a comfortable light green velvet pad to sit on. My fingers cautiously moved from the bench to one of the bottom drawer's pearl handles. I slid the drawer open a few inches. My fingers danced within, bringing out a tube of lipstick. I admired the gold foundation and the cosmetics' deep red color. I turned it over and read Crimson Fantasy through the house's empty corridor from the bottom of the base. I could hear automobile doors closing in the driveway. I felt terror pour through me as I struggled to regain my composure. I hurriedly closed the open drawer and approached Lisa's bedroom door. As I walked beneath the doorframe, a sense of panic washed over me when I realized the tube of lipstick was still in my fingers before I could turn around and return it. I heard the front doorknob turn. I didn't want to get caught peeking in my stepsister's room. I rushed for the door, closed it swiftly but quietly, and bolted down the hall to my room. I discreetly locked my door and returned to my bed. I closed my eyes and pretended to sleep as I heard 3 new members of my family enter the house. As I laid there, I could feel my heart hammering against my chest. I hope no one spotted me outside my room or anywhere near Lisa's room. Every second seemed like an hour. As the minutes passed without any startling incursion, I began to feel relieved, which was shortly dashed by a subtle but sharp knock on the door. I didn't answer, thinking it was best to continue pretending to be asleep, but before a second knock, the doorknob turned and I heard someone enter the room. Despite the complete silence, I could hear the door softly close and someone approach my bedside, keeping my eyes closed and attempting to keep my pulse rate from beating like a hummingbird. I felt a shift in weight as someone sat next to me on the bed. "Lily, I know you aren't sleeping. Open your eyes. I'd like to share with you about what I witnessed when we first entered the residence." Karen's voice echoed throughout the room, and was the missile that sank my heart one eye at a time. I carefully opened each and turned onto my back. I sat up on the bed, tucked my knees into my chest, and rested my chin on them. I clutched my legs and tried to avoid making eye contact with my stepmother. "I saw you walk out of Lisa's room. I want to know why you were in there," Karen questioned. 1,000 explanations raced through my thoughts, each sounding more absurd than the last. I was suddenly overwhelmed with sadness and despair. I considered the possibility that if I was honest with her, this woman would understand me and possibly want to help me. I was fascinated and wanted to explore the house. I could scarcely get out of my quivering lips. I first visited Lisa's room, which was fantastic. Everything is really stunning. She is stunningly lovely. Then I saw the vanity, which made me wonder. Perhaps I can figure out what makes her so attractive. Karen's mouth twisted up into a tiny smile. Her eyes were pitiful toward me. "Lisa, I understand, is a beautiful girl. She is my precious little angel. She resembles a Hollywood star. She is perfect. I understand your want to be like her, to appear like her. However, honey, ladies apply makeup to enhance their looks. And I'm sorry, but you don't have anything worth doing either. No matter how long you sit in front of the mirror and how much cosmetics you apply, you'll still look like yourself, and you should be proud of it." "Many gorgeous girls wish they could seem more natural," Karen added, her tone passive-hostile, backhanded, and condescending. "Also, gorgeous girls never have to work for anything in life. They have the world at their feet. You will not have to cope with that. You may create your own tiny personality." I stared down at my knees as her words struck my heart like a sledgehammer. It took everything I had not to let tears fall from my wounded spirit. Karen stood up from her bed and went to the door. She stood in the entryway, holding the door in her hands, ready to close it. She poked her head back inside and glanced at me. "And I realize you've gone through a lot, but I wanted to let you know that your father is going to be very busy. Not only is he working a lot of overtime, but Lisa needs him for her solo in the upcoming school musical, and I need him there to help me cope with the grief and pain of having to put my babies in a box in our closet. So I hope you understand that he won't have much time for you for a while. After all, you came into our family," Karen remarked with bitter disdain as she closed the door behind her. Hate, the drug, did not overpower my feelings. I felt abandoned and lonely inside. My mother, the one person who actually loved me, had succumbed to drugs. And now there may be one place I can call home. The only place I might find hope, love, and a fresh start. Did not want me. In that moment, I felt like a solitary star, perched under a pitch-black night sky. At the time, I felt like the only way out was to go away from the suffering, let the darkness extinguish my starlight, and to end my own life. The quilt lay undisturbed underneath me. It had been 4 hours since Karen entered my room and whispered the words that sliced through me like a dagger. It had been 4 hours since I first considered taking my own life as a solution to my terrible troubles. It had taken me 4 hours to lie there, staring at the wall, gripping Leo tightly, and debating whether or not to do it. It was now 2 in the morning. The red digits on the alarm clock beside my bed penetrated the darkness. I hadn't had much of an appetite the previous week, but now my stomach was growling like a caged tiger as I reflected on the implications of my last journey from my chamber. I decided that the chances of everyone being sound asleep were high enough to proceed to the kitchen. Once in the hallway, I tiptoed to the kitchen, Leo in tow. I emerged from the end of the corridor, turned right, and was at the kitchen's entrance in 10 steps. Fortunately for me, the several expensive appliances provided enough light through the darkness for me to navigate away to the marble tile floor. As I moved from the hall's carpet to the kitchen, the ground felt cold under my bare feet. My palm traced over the long matching marble counter as I made my way to the double-door refrigerator, which was fastened against the back wall like all of the other appliances surrounding me. It was dazzling stainless steel. I grabbed for a handle on the front of the refrigerator but found nothing to grab. Squinting my eyes and peering closer, I discovered that the surface was completely smooth, except for a pencil-thin line dividing the two doors. Stumped and still hungry. I returned to the long counter where I believed I had spotted a basket of fruit. I discovered it in the midst of the marble, a perfect hand-woven basket containing a variety of fruits. My tummy grumbled as I noticed what appeared to be a luscious red apple. I instantly grabbed it in my hands and discovered it to be slick and strange. I peered closer and saw the apple was made of wax, with a small wick hanging from the top. I grimaced and returned the apple imposter to its proper location. Disappointed, I gave up on my attempt to satisfy my hunger. Just as I was going to leave the kitchen, I heard footsteps in the hallway. After my last exploration of the house, I was overcome with terror and worry. I feared my stepmother's passive, bittersweet rage, but before I could move, a shadowy figure appeared at the end of the corridor and began walking toward the kitchen. Out of reflex, I closed my eyes and cowered. "Lily, is it you?" My father's voice echoed through the darkness, asking for me. I felt myself slowly unraveling from my tight ball of protection. "Yeah, it's my father," I replied back to him. While the most of my panic had subsided, I was still leery of letting myself get too comfy. "What are you up to at this hour?" My father's voice sounded fatigued and tired, but also concerned. "I do not know. I'm hungry, I suppose. I tried to find something to eat, but I believe the refrigerator handle is broken." I gave my explanation. I could hear my father giggle under his breath. He walked past me in his navy blue flannel sleeper pants and immaculate white cotton t-shirt, then paused in front of the refrigerator. He motioned me over with a slight hand gesture. I complied and walked over, standing behind my father. He pointed to the bottom of what appeared to be the right door of the steel structure. He put his finger 3 inches to the left of the pinstripe line, pressed the door, let go, and breathed a deep breath of chilly air. I felt a little amount of the obviously expensive technology, but it was quickly replaced by a question about why my father required a Jetsons refrigerator. It, like everything else in the house, appeared to have been assembled solely for the goal of impressing outsiders. Not to be practical, but to become the talk of those who witnessed it. I, who had spent the previous few years shopping for my mother and me and microwaving the majority of my dinners, found myself uninterested in all the fuss while wondering what other household items had secret concealed access methods. My father had taken out a glass bottle of milk and a tray of cookie bars. He then softly placed his hand on my back and walked me around to the opposite side of the countertop. There I discovered a row of wooden stools with fluffy black cushions. My father pulled one out and let me sit first. Then he found his own seat close to mine. The hunger pangs intensified as he brought the platter of cookie bars in front of us. A swirl of chocolate was used to cover the graham cracker base. My mouth watered as I reached for my first one, which lasted 5 minutes. We sat in silence as I ate my second thick cookie bar. My stomach, now satisfied, was telling me how nice cold milk would taste. After a short glance at the counter, I turned to my father. "We need glasses," I mentioned. No glasses," he stated plainly. "This is my moment. I come out here once a week. I get to be alone. I get to drink out of the bottle. I get to be alone myself." I suddenly assumed my father was giving me a hint. I whispered a brief apology before rising from my stool. "I was not telling you to go, youngster. Now is my moment, our time. It allows me to enjoy some cookies and milk with my daughter, whom I haven't seen in quite some time." He spoke to me kindly. My father grabbed the enormous bottle of milk, wrapped his palm around its neck, and bent his wrist to bring it to his lips. He took 3 big gulps. He returned the bottle to the counter and let out a faint belch. I giggled slightly as I looked up at my father and noticed a long white milk mustache over his top lips. "What?" he inquired, pretending surprise while giving a large, loving smile. He then pushed the bottle over to me and motioned for me to take my own drink. I placed my small palm on the bottle's neck, barely wrapping my fingers around it. Halfway around my other hand, I found the bottom and lifted it to my lips. I tilted the glass container and took a big chug of milk. My little body let out a high-pitched burp, and the bottle found its way back to the table. My father chuckled as he noticed the big matching milk mustache streaming from my lips. The early sun shone through the windows of my room. It was now Saturday, 8 hours after my late-night dessert snack with my father, and for the first time in a long time, I awakened with a sense of hope, albeit it was still very little. It was doing a wonderful job of distracting me from the terrible emotions that plagued me every day. Rolling out of bed, I searched my bedroom floor for the identical denim blue jeans I had worn the day before. With only a few pairs of pants, I frequently had little choice but to wear the same pants 2 or 3 days in a row. Today was no different. As I raised the worn fabric off the ground, something fell from my pocket and bounced off the carpet. As I reached down, picked it up, and examined it, I realized I was looking at Lisa's lipstick. "I have to give it back," I said, moaning to myself aloud. My head sank low as I gripped the cosmetic tube hard in my palm. I realized I couldn't do this path alone. I quickly grabbed Leo in my left arm and drew him to my side. I turned and slowly exited my room into the corridor. While walking, I envisioned Lisa's response in my brain. At worst, I expected my stepsister to take the makeup off and tell me to leave her room. At best, I imagined Lisa enjoying my honesty and inviting me to use her makeup and magnificent vanity whenever I wished. Realistically, I understood it was more likely to land on the negative side. My heart was hammering like a jackhammer within my chest as I approached my stepsister's door. Making a loose fist, I raised my hand, flicked my wrist, and lightly tapped the door with my knuckles. The light beat was followed by no response, so I used a bit more power this time, raising the volume of my knock. Lisa's voice came through the door, approaching cautiously like a gazelle entering a lioness's den. I carefully turned the handle and creaked. "The door is open." The door slowly opened, revealing Lisa sitting on the bench in front of the vanity, looking in the mirror and stroking her perfectly straight blonde hair. The 2 step-siblings established eye contact in the mirror. Lisa spoke first. "What do you want?" The nerves in my gut became even tighter. Lisa's stern tone made it clear that this would not be an easy task. Regardless, I took a few steps into the room, unsure what to say and whether I'd be able to form the words. I simply reached my arm out to Lisa. I did not mean to. Was all I could summon as my fingers sluggishly crept off the tube of lipstick and revealed it in the palm of my hand, my head down in shame. I could still see my stepsister in the mirror. As soon as Lisa's sight fell on the item in my palms, her eyes widened in disbelief, then squinted in fury. "Did you steal my makeup?" Lisa accused me as she rose from the bench and turned to confront me. I was only staring at it when Lisa's violent words interrupted my quiet, almost whisper-like explanation. You were in my room, and you stole my cosmetics. You ugly little brat. Just because you appear like a troll does not mean that my makeup will change that. You will never look like me. You will never be me. You are not even supposed to be here. You are not even a member of this family. Your father did not love you enough to see you, and you are only here because he felt sorry for you. You sad little loser. How would you like it if I took something from you? Lisa's comments struck my soul like poisoned darts fired at point-blank range. I winced at each one, but did not feel angry in return. Instead, I felt guilt and emptiness. Lisa wasn't done. You don't have anything worth taking. Even your silly little bear is unattractive. How would you like it if I took that? It can be beneficial for you to mature and stop acting like a child. I always have it with me. With Lisa's final words, she reached out and grasped Leo's dangling arm, pulling firmly. I was caught off guard, but I recovered enough to grab the end of Leo's leg and begin an immediate tug of war for my blue fuzzy bear. Stop! You will hurt him! I pleaded with my stepsister. Hurt him? What are you, 6? Lisa shot back. Please stop. I'll never come back here again. Please let Leo go, I implored. This time, my stepsister is attempting to grab my cuddly bear and find peace in my own room. I bet you'll never come back here. And the bear is now mine. Lisa gave me a powerful pull that drew me forward 2 paces. Let go, I yelled out in rage and desperation as it was my turn to give Leo a powerful tug. Except when I pulled, Lisa did not come forward like she usually did. Instead, there was a loud rip sound that cut through the air. The strain in Leo's leg was relieved as his body returned to my grip. It was lacking one arm. When I looked up, everything in front of me seemed to be happening in slow motion. As I watched Lisa lose her footing, time seemed to slow down. After Leo's arm severed in her hand, Lisa lurched backward and flailed, unable to catch herself, but it was too late. I stared in disbelief as Lisa fell back into the vanity, tumbling to the ground and landing on top of it. The glass in the mirror shattered, and Lisa collapsed on top of it before either of us could react. There were 2 sets of loud, heavy footsteps running down the corridor. My father was the first to come in the doorway. He stared in astonishment at the spectacle before him. Karen was the second to arrive, and when she saw her baby girl laying on top of the broken vanity mirror, she screamed in dread and horror. She pushed my father aside and raced to her daughter. Lily, what have you done? Were the first words my father spoke before I could respond. Karen interjected. I will tell you what she did, John. She came in here to ask Lisa whether she could use her makeup, and Lisa said no. Lily became so jealous and enraged that she pushed Lisa into the vanity. By the way, the vanity was one of a kind and would take me ages to replace. Karen's unfounded allegations flowed so easily that she turned back to her daughter, who was now sitting up. Lisa appeared fine, save for her now messy hair and a 2-inch superficial cut on her left cheek. It was such a shallow cut that, although being red, it could not produce a single drop of blood. And look at my poor baby. That is going to leave a scar. I know it. I know it, John. We need to take her to the emergency department. She may have sustained internal injuries. I'm going to get her in the car. You take care of that girl. Karen seemed to refuse to refer to me as John's daughter. Karen assisted Lisa in getting to her feet and guided her out of the room by placing her daughter's arm over her own shoulder. As they went past me, Karen shot me, an angry, bitter expression. When they were out of their room, my father turned to face me. Lily, is what Karen said correct? John questioned me quietly and solemnly. Shaken by the events of the previous 15 minutes, I tried to find words. I realized I would look to be making an excuse, so I just babbled anything came to mind. Dad, I just didn't. I was promptly interrupted. Lily, don't lie to me. Please don't lie to me. My father immediately blamed and ordered at the same time. But I'm not lying, I stammered pitifully. My father's eyes were filled with mounting anger and despair. Lily, I want you to go to your room and spend the rest of the night. I'm going to take Karen and Lisa to the ER. Don't come out. Tomorrow is your first day of school. And you're going. I don't want to hear any more about it. I'm quite disappointed in you. I truly hoped this would work, Lily. I actually did. But I am beginning to wonder if you would be better off somewhere else. My father trailed off in such a dejected tone that it nearly brought tears to my eyes. If I wasn't already so empty inside, it would have happened gradually. I passed by my father before turning down the hallway. I paused just inside my door and peered back down the hallway. My father stood with his head lowered beneath Lisa's doorframe. Dad, I tried to communicate one last time. Simply go to your room, Lily. My father spoke with defeat as he turned and proceeded to the front door. I slowly closed my door behind me. I crawled into bed and lay Leo next to me, lying on my side. I stroked my finger across the massive rip where his bare arm used to be. He's torn just like me, I thought to myself. I held him in my arms and stared at the wall. I replayed my recent memories in my thoughts, beginning with discovering my mother dead in my own home. As the images in my imagination became more real, darkness began to creep into my heart. I discovered my heart and soul submerged in a sea of numbness. I was finally defeated. I had reached a breaking point. My inner sentiments overpowered me, and I was convinced I no longer belonged in this world. The one person who had ever truly loved me had died, and I wished to follow her. I closed my eyes. I have made up my mind. There was no going back now. Tomorrow would be my final day on Earth. After school, I would go home. And now that everyone had left the house, I would commit suicide. I was bewildered as to how someone could wake up on their last day of life feeling perfectly tranquil. I had been lying awake for the past half hour, staring at my alarm clock. That alone was a fascinating occasion for me. Each click of the minute, each digit change, felt like a gradual countdown to my last moments on Earth. It was a fresh feeling to see my life slowly slipping away. However, it wasn't exactly staring at the wall. I wanted to spend as little time as possible with the other 3 individuals in my house. It was my final day alive, and I didn't want to deal with my stepsister's chilly glare, my stepmother's overly pleasant, passive-aggressive tone, or my own father's total apathy. I had heard them coming home from the hospital about an hour after leaving yesterday night. My stepmother was furious with the emergency department nurse for refusing to admit her daughter due to a slight laceration. I had also heard my father's strong reluctance to see a plastic surgeon for an injury that was little larger than the typical paper cut. So I got up at 5:30 that morning and took the shortest, quietest shower of my life. Quickly. I had put on a worn navy blue hooded sweatshirt and faded blue jeans that were 2 inches too long for me. Then I spent the rest of the morning watching the clock. It was now 7:15, and I had politely declined my father's whispered offer of cereal, slung my canvas bag over my shoulder, and walked to the front door of the house. As I crept out, I took care to lock the front door behind me. Everyone had already left for their different days' schedules. My father was currently at work. Lisa was at a morning musical rehearsal, and my stepmother Karen was probably out shopping earlier that morning when my father made a flat-out offer of cereal. He was also keen to note that there would be a school bus in front of the house at 7:30. I was glad to hear that, because I tried everything I could to shut out every word he spoke. After walking down the walkway, I found myself standing where it intersected the sidewalk in front of the home. As I waited for my ride to school, my thoughts turned to the various ways I could carry out the dark crime that afternoon after school. Before I could let my mind go wild, the hydraulic brakes of the long, huge, yellow metallic beast in front of me jolted me back to reality. I kept my head down and tried to draw as little notice as possible. I got on the bus and picked an empty seat halfway to the back, trying not to make eye contact with anyone. I held my purse and kept my head down within my peripheral vision. I noticed a pair of black canvas high-top Converse with hot pink laces on the bus floor across the aisle. That was sufficient for me. I didn't dare to allow my gaze wander up and catch the attention of whoever those feet belonged to. The commute to school gradually became a site of suicidal contemplation for me. I let my gaze drift to the ground between my feet as my mind raced over my life and the possibilities I had for ending it that afternoon. Just as I was about to decide which road I would take to no longer exist, I felt raised slightly in my seat and snapped to attention. I noticed my quick change of personal elevation was caused by someone plopping down next to me on the huge cushioned bench, resulting in the sudden incursion of private space next to me. I found myself almost staring at the person currently sitting next to me. It all started with the black sneakers with hot pink laces that were across the aisle. But now we're on the ground, close to my faded white tennis sneakers. My gaze traveled upward, revealing a pair of legs dressed in black tights, a red plaid knee-high skirt, a white long-sleeved dress shirt with a black corset vest, and a long, very loose, knotted red necktie hanging around a pale neck, shifting my focus to the intruder's face. I noticed a girl with a large smile on her face. Her huge smile caused her already round cheeks to push out even further over her cheekbones. My gaze then shifted to the girl next to me, whose eyes were dazzling and innocent. I became nervous and quickly averted my gaze, focusing on the girl's head. On top of it was a black cadet hat with a large red cross on the front. Long auburn locks hung behind the cap, extending a few inches beyond her shoulders. "Hello, I'm Jessica. What is your name? Sorry if I am invading. I do not mean to intrude. You seemed forlorn, and I'd never seen you before. You seem like you might use a friend. Not that I'm saying you don't have pals. How would I know? I know nothing about you, not even your name. That's why I just asked it." Of course. The girl next to me spoke in such a frenzied tone that I almost had to keep my jaw from dropping. I paused in my response for a brief minute, before Jessica pounced all over it with another energetic, boastful remark. "I'm very sorry if I scared you. I did, right? I knew it. I don't always speak like this. Just when I meet new people or feel apprehensive. It resembles a tic or something. But now I'm sitting here scaring the poop out of you, sounding like an over-the-top Saturday morning cartoon character high on pixie sticks or something. So, what is your name?" "Lily. Lily Brown." I startled myself by letting my name slip out as a response. Jessica responded, "It's a blessing to meet you, Lily Brown," in a humorous tone that made me feel embarrassed. I apologize. I was only joking. "It's fantastic to meet you. We're going to be best pals." "I already know it." "Probably not," I mumbled as I stared at the floor. "I knew it. I came across as a rambling monster, which terrified you. I do not blame you. I am not the most typical person. That probably explains why I don't have many friends. I mean, I have some buddies from my youth group, but at school, not really. Most people are kind, but not friends. There's no one there who really knows me. But if you do not want to be friends, I understand." Jessica's comment stayed with me, reminding me that this was the most anyone had said to me in as long as I could remember. Remember, no, it is not you. It isn't like that. I am going to be relocating soon. Really soon. I devised a strategy to dismiss her without informing Jessica of the true reason I wouldn't be available to hang together. "Really? Wow. I haven't seen you before, so you must be new here, and you're leaving. That is unusual. So, we have one day to become the best friends in the world. That way, when you depart, you must maintain in touch with me." Jessica spoke in such a cheerful, upbeat tone that she once again caught me off guard. I wasn't sure what to say. On my final day alive, the last thing I wanted to do was make friends with anyone. I wasn't cruel enough to brush Jessica aside. Jessica didn't strike me as someone who could be ignored. I concluded that it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world to let someone sit next to me on the way to school, as long as I could persuade her to stop talking. I don't feel like talking today. I tried to be courteous and asked Jessica not to speak my ear off. Jessica responded politely, saying, "That's fine. Some of the best things are unsaid." She then reached into the side of the rucksack between her thighs and retrieved a pink iPod without asking. Jessica placed one of the white plastic earphones in my right ear. She inserted the other one into her own left ear, tucked her knees into the back of the seat in front of her, and slid back, relaxed. I began to object. "We are not talking." Jessica quickly reminded me in a sly, matter-of-fact tone. I gave up my half-hearted fight and relaxed back into my seat. In addition, the music playing into my inner ear canal was from an alternative rock band that I had never heard of before. It was heavy on bass and percussion, and the few lyrics I heard didn't seem to fit the typical rock music mold. Just before I leaned my head against the bus window, I looked down at the face of the digital music player. I could see the word Paramore next to the music title. Jessica closed her eyes and shook her head back and forth, softly listening to the music next to me. The female vocalist's lyrics played quietly in my ear as I rested my head against the window, and for the first time that day, my thoughts seemed less grim. The first day of school seemed like agony. The morning bus journey with Jessica was undoubtedly the highlight of the day. After being assigned with her, we spent the most of the morning being herded from one orientation session to the next. Jessica did her best to maintain a steady flow of small talk, but it generally fell on deaf ears, while I could appreciate her efforts. My mind was already reverting to its previous gloomy state. Jessica was a truly decent person, and the more I studied her, the more I realized this. Her continuous efforts to befriend me had no hidden intent. She had a genuine warmth that I began to covet. However, I knew it would be ineffective. Today was my final day. There was no way to change that. No amount of warmth or friendliness could alter the path I had chosen for myself. I was finished with this world. Jessica was only a temporary distraction from the inevitable. As noon approached, Jessica insisted that we sit together. I had no objections. Even though I wasn't very hungry, we picked a table in the cafeteria that was quite isolated from the larger student groups. As we sat down with our trays, Jessica, ever the talker, attempted to engage me in conversation. "Do you like your classes thus far?" Jess asked, taking a bite from her apple. I shrugged, prodding at the unappealing pile of mashed potatoes on my platter. "They're fine, I suppose. Just okay." Jessica smiled and remarked, "I suppose that's better than terrible. I am confident you will get used to them in no time. And who knows, maybe you'll like some of them." "I doubt it," I said, feeling the weight of the decision I took earlier in the day bear down on me. It was pointless to pretend that any of this mattered. I am not really in the mood for school right now." Jessica gave me a troubled expression. But before she could say anything else, a loud voice interrupted our chat. "So what have we got here?" The voice belonged to a tall, lanky boy with a smug grin. He was accompanied by two other boys, both of whom appeared equally smug. A couple of losers, sitting alone. How cute. Jessica glared at the boy, unfazed by his presence. "Leave us alone, Derek. We're just trying to eat lunch." Derek laughed, obviously enjoying himself. "Oh, Jessica, don't act like that. We're just having fun. Furthermore, you should be mindful who you associate with. You don't want to damage your reputation by associating with someone like her." Derek described the poison as stinging more than I wanted to admit. I had spent the majority of my life feeling like an outcast. And now, on my final day of life, I was reminded of how worthless I was in the eyes of others. Jessica, on the other hand, was not about to give Derek the final word. You know what, Derek? Jessica stood up from her seat and addressed him directly. You are nothing more than a bully, and I would rather be friends with Lily than someone like you any day. Derek's grin faltered for a moment, apparently not expecting Jessica to challenge him, but he swiftly recovered, his countenance hardening. Whatever, Jessica. Remember, you're the one making the error here, not me. Derek turned and went away, followed closely by his lackeys. Jessica sat back down, looking slightly agitated but triumphant. I looked at her in wonder. Nobody had ever stood up for me like that before. Why did you do that? I inquired, my tone barely above a whisper. Jessica gazed at me, her face softening. Because you deserve to be treated better than that, Lily. Everybody does. I wasn't sure how to answer. Nobody had ever told me I deserved anything before. It was always the contrary. I had spent so much time believing that I was worthless and did not deserve affection or friendship. However, Jessica was present. Someone who hardly knew me was telling me otherwise. For the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps things could be different, but the darkness within me remained too strong, and I quickly killed that flame before it could take hold. The remainder of the day was a blur. I went through the motions, attending classes and listening to the teachers, but not really absorbing anything. My thoughts were fixed on the end of the day, when I'd finally be able to follow out my plan. Jessica remained by my side the entire time, never leaving me alone. I even tried to detach myself from her. It was as if she sensed something was amiss and refused to let me go through it alone. I was fatigued by the time the final bell rung to signify the end of the school day, emotional, mental, and bodily. I simply wanted everything to be over. Jessica walked me to the bus. Her pleasant mood never wavered, even though I could tell she was concerned about me. Jessica sat next to me on the bus, just as she had that morning. The ride home was quiet. Neither of us said much, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. Jessica seemed to understand that I needed distance, yet she still wanted to be there for me. When the bus eventually arrived in front of my house, I paused for a bit before stepping off. Part of me wanted to stay on the bus and ride with Jessica, delaying my plans, but I knew I couldn't. I'd made up my mind, and there was no going back. Now. Thank you for today. I spoke quietly as I stood to leave. I sincerely appreciate it. Jessica smiled at me, a warm and sincere grin that made my heart ache. Anytime. Lily, remember that I'm available if you ever need someone to talk to. I nodded, my throat too tight to say anything else. I hopped off the bus and began walking up the driveway to my house. I felt the weight of my decision bear down on me even more. This was it. The end. When I entered the house, the comfortable silence welcomed me like an old friend. My father was still at work, and I knew Karen and Lisa would not be home for a bit. I had the house to myself, exactly as I had planned. I made my way to my room and closed the door behind me. I placed my stuff on the floor and sat on the side of my bed, staring at the wall. My mind was whirling with thoughts and feelings, but one thing was certain. I could not go on like this any longer. I reached under my bed and brought out the small box that I had hidden earlier in the week. Inside was the bottle of medications I had taken from Karen's restroom. I'd grabbed them one by one, unobserved, until I had enough to complete the task at hand. My hands shook as I opened the bottle, the little tablets clanging against the plastic. I poured them into my palms. The small white tablets stared up at me, providing the respite I desperately needed. I knew it would not take long. In only a few minutes, all would be over. No more agony or loneliness, no more feeling as if I didn't belong. I took a deep breath. The pills weighed heavily in my hand. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for. I closed my eyes, ready to end it all. But suddenly, out of nowhere, a thought crossed my head. Jessica, her smile and friendliness, her unshakable belief that I deserved something. I deserved better. I remembered how she had stood up for me, how she had supported me when no one else had. She saw something in me, something I couldn't see for myself. The pills in my hands felt like lead. I opened my eyes and glanced down at them, my resolve shaky. Could I actually accomplish this? Could I truly leave this planet without giving it? And myself, one final chance. Tears welled in my eyes, blinding my vision. I wanted to end the misery, but I didn't want to let down the one person who had showed me care, the only one who made me feel like I was worthwhile. With a stifled sob, I dumped the tablets onto the bed and watched them spread across the blanket. I could not do it. I could not go through with it. Jessica had given me hope, and I was not ready to give it up just yet. I sank on the bed, tears streaming freely. I cried for what I had lost, for all the anguish I had been through, for the life I nearly threw away. And while I grieved, I felt a small spark of hope rekindle within me. It was little, hardly a flicker, but it was there, and for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful that things could improve. As I laid there, my body was filled with sobs. I knew I wasn't out of the woods yet. The darkness was still lurking in the corners of my thoughts, waiting for an opportunity to take over again. But I also realized I wasn't alone anymore. I had someone who was concerned about me, believed in me, and would be there for me if I needed her. And it made all the difference. I stayed in bed for a long time, the tears slowly fading as fatigue set in. I felt emotionally exhausted, but there was also a peculiar sense of relief, as if a big weight had been removed from my shoulders. I hadn't made any decisions regarding the future, but I had gotten through the day. That was enough for now. As dusk shadows began to fall across my chamber, I heard the front door open and close. My father was home. I heard his footsteps echoing throughout the house, traveling from room to room, most likely seeking for me. Part of me wished to remain hidden in my room, but another part of me realized I couldn't ignore him forever. I needed to confront him and everything. I slowly got out of bed, brushing away the last tears from my cheeks. I took a deep breath before opening my bedroom door. The hall was faintly illuminated. The fading light from outside casts lengthy shadows on the walls. I paused for a while before proceeding to the living room where I expected to find my father. He was sitting on the couch, head in his hands, looking more exhausted and defeated than I'd ever seen him. When he heard my entrance, he looked up. His eyes were red and tired. For a minute, we simply stared at each other, unsure what to say. Finally, he ended the stillness. "Lily, He paused, seeking to find the perfect words. "I apologize. I realize things have been difficult. I know I haven't been as present for you as I should have been." I did not say anything, just observed as he fought to suppress his own emotions. "I've been so preoccupied with my own troubles, with all that has happened, that I didn't understand how much you were hurting," he said, his voice shaking. "I should have been there for you, Lily. I should have been a better dad." The weight of his words lingered in the air between us. For the first time, I recognized my father as a man who, like me, was struggling. He was not flawless. He'd made mistakes. But in that moment, I could tell he was trying and cared. "I'm sorry, too." I eventually spoke, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've been angry with you for a long time, but I believe I was simply hurting. I didn't know how to deal with everything that had transpired with Mom, including the move here." My father nodded. His eyes were full of grief and regret. "I miss her too, you know. Every day, the admission took me by surprise and caught me. I always assumed that he had moved on, that he no longer cared about my mother. But suddenly I knew he had been hiding his own pain underneath the surface. "I miss her so much," I whispered, tears welling up again. "It aches a lot." He jumped up from the couch and approached me, bringing me into a tight hug. I struggled for a time before melting into his embrace and allowing my emotions to fall freely. We stood there for what seemed like hours, just embracing each other and sharing the grief that we'd been carrying alone for so long. When we eventually parted ways, there was an understanding between us, a common link that had not existed previously. We still had a long way to go, but for the first time, I felt hopeful that we could get through this together. "I'm here for you, Lily," my father murmured softly. "I realize I haven't been the best father, but I'm going to try. I'm going to be better." I nodded, not trusting my ability to talk. It was not a guarantee that everything would be well, but it was a beginning. And that was enough for now. The next several days were a flurry of emotions, but there was a newfound sense of hope. My father and I began to chat more, discussing everything that had happened, my mother, and how we were both feeling. It wasn't easy, and there were still awkward and painful moments, but it was a step forward. Jessica remained a continuous presence in my life. Her upbeat spirit and unwavering positivity gradually chipped away at the darkness that had enveloped me for so long. She never pushed me to talk about what had happened, but she was always there when I needed someone to listen, divert me, or simply be present. I still had a lot of mending to do, and I knew the road ahead would not be easy. But for the first time in a long time, I felt less alone. I had my father and Jessica, and I had a glimmer of hope that things would improve as the weeks progressed. I began to have moments of bliss again, small pockets of delight that reminded me of what it was like to be alive. I started focusing on what made me happy, like spending time with Jessica, discovering new hobbies, and gradually mending my relationship with my father. There were still some awful days when darkness crept back in, threatening to consume me. But on those days, I reminded myself of the individuals who loved me, believed in me, and were there for me. And it made all the difference. In time, I realized that life was worth living, that there was a lot more ahead of me than just the anguish of the past. I had no idea what the future would bring, but I was prepared to take it one day at a time. I no longer felt compelled to commit suicide. Instead, I focused on living, finding things that made me happy, and creating a future I could be proud of. It wasn't simple, and there were still obstacles to face, but I knew I wasn't alone any longer, which made all the difference. As the sun set on another day, I sat on my father's porch, gazing out at the world with a renewed sense of hope. I had almost given up, but now I was resolved to keep going, to fight for the life I deserved. And for the first time in a long time, I felt confident that everything would be well. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed listening, please like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Also, leave a comment below to share your thoughts on what happened.